She had been invisible for 3 years. Invisible in the hallways of Hartwell Military Medical Center. Invisible in the morning briefings nobody invited her to. Invisible in the break room where the senior nurses stopped talking whenever she walked in. She wore blue scrubs and kept her head down and did her job so quietly that most of the doctors couldn't have told you her name. But the man in room 412, the Navy SEAL with the shattered spine and the empty eyes, he looked at her differently. He looked at her like he knew something. And on the night he moved his finger for the first time in 11 weeks, he didn't call for the doctor. He waited. He waited until the hallway was empty and the monitors were humming low, and when she stepped close enough to check his IV line, he opened his cracked lips and whispered 2 words in a voice like gravel dragged across concrete. 2 words that hadn't been spoken aloud in 7 years. 2 words that should have been classified. Her hand stopped moving, her breath stopped moving, because those 2 words were her call sign. The one she'd carried on missions that didn't exist, in places that were never on any map. And nobody in this hospital knew that name. Nobody. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel don't pull punches, and they don't give you easy endings. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This one is just getting started. The morning shift at Hartwell Military Medical Center started at 5:45, which meant that by 5:30, Nurse Mara Devlin was already on the 4th floor, restocking the supply cart and pretending not to notice the way the overnight staff looked through her when they passed. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was something more specific than that. The particular brand of dismissal reserved for people who were considered temporary, peripheral, not worth the energy of forming an opinion about. Mara had been transferred to the neurotrauma ward 8 months ago after a quiet request from hospital administration, and in those 8 months, she had learned that the 4th floor operated on a hierarchy as rigid and unspoken as anything she'd encountered in the service. At the top of that hierarchy sat Dr. Warren Selby. She could hear him before she saw him most mornings. The deliberate clip of his dress shoes on the linoleum, the way his voice carried without effort, the small pause that fell over nursing stations when he arrived. He was 46, square-jawed, with the kind of confidence that had calcified somewhere around his 3rd published paper into something closer to contempt. He ran the neurotrauma unit like a private kingdom, and he'd built his reputation on a combination of genuine brilliance and a complete unwillingness to be questioned. Mara had learned that on her 3rd day, when she'd flagged an inconsistency in a patient's medication chart and been told, without eye contact, to leave the clinical decisions to the people with medical degrees. She'd said nothing. She'd gone back to her cart. She'd made a quiet note in her personal log and moved on. That was how she survived in places like this. Quietly. With patience. With the kind of stillness that people who'd never needed it often mistook for passivity. Room 412 was at the end of the East Corridor, past the nurses' station and the family waiting area that was almost always empty. The patient inside, Commander Declan Voss, U.S. Navy, had been transferred to Hartwell 11 weeks ago from a military hospital in Virginia, and the paperwork that came with him was thicker than his chart and twice as redacted. Mara knew the broad strokes because everyone on the floor knew the broad strokes. Declan Voss was 38 years old. He'd been a SEAL for 15 years, decorated more times than his file admitted. 13 weeks ago, during an operation the Navy described only as a training exercise, something had gone catastrophically wrong with his spine. The injury was at the C5 to C6 level, cervical vertebrae, upper spinal cord, and when he arrived at Hartwell, the consulting team had done their assessments and delivered their verdict with the clinical efficiency of people who'd learned to stop feeling the weight of those conversations. Complete motor paralysis below the shoulders. Likely permanent. She'd read that assessment, she'd read it twice. And then she'd looked at the man lying in room 412, at the way his eyes moved across the ceiling with a precision and intentionality that didn't belong to someone whose brain was as quiet as the doctor seemed to believe. And she'd thought, something's wrong with this picture. But that was 8 months ago. And in 8 months, she'd learned to keep thoughts like that to herself. The room was dim when she pushed the door open at 5:53. The overnight monitor was cycling through its checks, the amber numbers steady on the screen. Mara moved through the routine, vital signs, IV line, position check, with the efficiency of someone who'd done it so many times that her hands worked independently of her conscious mind. She'd gotten used to the silence in this room. Voss didn't speak. The chart noted that he could speak. His airway was clear, his vocal cords intact. But in 11 weeks at Hartwell, the only sounds documented from him were breathing, and twice, something the overnight nurse had logged as possible vocalization, unclear. She was leaning over to adjust the angle of his pillow when she noticed it. His eyes weren't tracking the ceiling. They were tracking her. Not the unfocused drift she'd cataloged before. This was deliberate. His gaze moved with her as she stepped around the bed, held when she paused, shifted when she shifted. She'd seen that quality of attention before, in situations where it had mattered enormously, and something in her chest did a slow, careful tightening. She stood still. She looked back at him. His eyes moved left, then right, then left twice, then held center. She knew that pattern. She'd used that pattern. It was a basic field signal, not military standard, not any official protocol. But she'd used a variation of it 7 years ago in a windowless room in a situation she still wasn't cleared to discuss. And the specific rhythm of it was distinctive enough that coincidence felt like wishful thinking. Her voice came out very level. "Good morning, Commander." His eyes moved. Left, center, right, center. Acknowledgement. She kept her face neutral. She finished adjusting the pillow. She charted the vitals with the same unhurried handwriting she always used. And when she left room 412 at 6:04, she spent the 45-second walk to the supply closet, dismantling every assumption she'd made about the last 8 months. Dr. Warren Selby's morning rounds began at 7:30, and Mara had learned to position herself on the periphery, close enough to hear, far enough not to be asked questions she wasn't supposed to answer. She watched him move through 412 with the brisk efficiency of a man who'd already made up his mind. He checked the monitor, flipped through 2 pages of the chart, made a note, and was heading for the door in under 4 minutes. "No change," he said to no one in particular. The resident trailing him, a young man named Prakash, who always looked mildly panicked, wrote it down. Mara said, "His eye tracking is different this morning." The words were out before she'd fully decided to say them. She felt the temperature in the corridor shift. Selby stopped. He turned. He had a way of looking at people when he was deciding whether they warranted a full response or just a dismissal, and she could feel that calculation happening now. "Pardon?" His eye tracking. When I did the 553 check, he was tracking my movement with bilateral consistency. Yesterday morning, there was a rightward bias. The change is notable. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. "You're documenting this." "I noted it in my log, yes." "Your nursing log." He said it the way someone might say your crayon drawing. "Mara, eye movement in spinal cord injury patients is subject to enormous variability based on sleep cycles, medication timing, and a dozen other factors that we account for in the neurological assessment, which is my department. What I need from you is accurate vitals and timely medication administration. The eye tracking assessment is something we handle in rounds." He paused. "Was there something else?" "No," she said. "Thank you, doctor." He walked away. Prakash gave her a look that was either apologetic or uncertain and followed. Mara stood in the corridor for a moment, her hands at her sides, and thought about the eye movement pattern and the 7-year-old memory it had triggered, and she made herself breathe slowly and keep her face completely still. She'd been dismissed before, in rooms with much higher stakes than this one. She went back to her cart. The thing about Hartwell Military Medical Center was that it occupied an unusual institutional space, technically a civilian hospital, but with a dedicated wing for active duty and veteran patients that operated under a separate administrative structure and a separate funding stream. This made it, in practice, a place where 2 different worlds brushed against each other without ever quite integrating. The civilian staff had their hierarchy, their protocols, their politics. The military patients had their silence, their stoicism, their particular brand of suffering that civilian training didn't always know how to read. Mara had existed in the gap between those 2 worlds for 8 months, She knew which side she was supposed to belong to and which side she actually understood. She'd served 6 years in the Air Force as a pararescue specialist, a PJ in the language of the service. The pipeline was brutal. 2 years of training before you were cleared for operational deployment, more schools than most people knew existed, a specific and devastating skill set that blended combat medicine with search and rescue in situations where the conventional answer was that nobody was coming. She'd done 4 deployments. She'd gone into places that showed up on no flight manifest. She'd carried people out of situations where impossible was the starting point, not the obstacle. She'd left the service on her own terms, at 31, for reasons she didn't explain to people who didn't already know. She'd put herself through accelerated nursing training and taken a job at a regional hospital in Oregon and spent 2 years being consistently the most competent person in any emergency situation while making sure nobody noticed. Then the transfer to Hartwell. Then the 4th floor. Then room 412. She hadn't recognized Declan Voss when he arrived. Not immediately. His face was thinner than the last time she'd seen it, and the last time she'd seen it had been in a helicopter at altitude in the dark, and she'd been focused on keeping him conscious while his team sergeant held pressure on a wound that wasn't supposed to exist. He'd been unconscious for most of that evacuation. She hadn't known his name. She'd known his vitals and his blood type and the specific way his breathing changed when the altitude got to him. And she'd known those things with the intimate precision of someone whose job was to know them. She'd thought about that extraction maybe twice in 7 years. It was one of dozens. It was the work. But the eye movement pattern this morning had lodged in her chest like a splinter, and through the next 3 hours of her shift, she kept turning it over. The rhythm of it, the deliberateness, the sense that someone behind those eyes was working very hard to communicate through the only channel left available. At 9:40, she took her break in the east stairwell instead of the break room. She sat on the landing and looked at her hands and did the mental work of deciding what she was actually sure about. She was sure that Declan Voss's eye tracking had changed in a measurable and specific way. She was sure that the pattern she'd observed matched a voluntary communication signal, not a neurological artifact. She was sure that Selby had dismissed this without examination. She was not sure whether what she'd seen was coincidence. She was not sure whether her memory of that evacuation, fragments, darkness, noise, was being superimposed on a situation that only superficially resembled it. She went back to the floor at 9:55 and checked in 3 other rooms before letting herself return to 412. It was quiet. The morning light was coming through the blinds at a low angle, laying stripes across the floor. She checked the monitor. She checked the IV. She stood at the bedside and looked at him directly. His eyes came to her immediately. The tracking was smooth, deliberate, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. She said, very quietly, "Are you trying to communicate?" Left, center, left, center. Yes, yes. Her pulse did something she didn't let show. She said, "Blink once for yes, 2 times for no." 1 blink, slow, deliberate. She exhaled. "Can you hear me clearly?" 1 blink. "Do you know where you are?" 1 blink. "Do you know why you can't move?" A pause. 2 blinks. That stopped her. "You don't know or you can't say?" His eyes moved. A new pattern. 3 left. 1 center. A hesitation. And she realized with a cold clarity that he was trying to give her more than a yes or no, and the frustration of not being able to must have been unimaginable. She said, "I'm going to ask more specific questions. We'll go slowly." 1 blink. She spent 19 minutes in that room. She left with 4 certainties she hadn't had before, and a deep, sour unease about what she was going to do with them. Dr. Selby's afternoon case conference was in the 3rd floor meeting room at 2 o'clock, and Mara wasn't on the invitation list. This was not unusual. She'd never been on the invitation list. She'd learned about it by accident 6 weeks ago when she'd gone to that room looking for a reference binder and found 8 people arranged around a table debating the care of patients whose names she recognized from her morning rounds. She didn't attend the conference. She waited outside the lab on the 2nd floor where Prakash usually stopped to pick up printed results after rounds, and she caught him there at 2:48, looking harried and slightly guilty. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "Mara, I can't. I'm not asking you to do anything. I just need you to listen. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed and leaned against the wall and said, "What?" She walked him through it in the efficient, specific language of someone who'd briefed commanding officers under time pressure. The eye tracking, the voluntary pattern, the 19 minutes of structured questioning, what Voss had been able to confirm, that he had sensation below the injury level, not consistent sensation, not reliable, but present, that the paralysis had changed in character over the past 3 weeks in a way that didn't match the original injury profile, that he had numbness in a pattern more consistent with compression than with cord transaction. Prakash listened. His expression went through several phases. "That's," he started. "I know what it sounds like. It sounds like you're suggesting a missed compression injury, which would mean the original diagnosis may be incomplete and the treatment plan may need to be revised." She kept her voice even. "I'm not making a diagnostic claim. I'm reporting observations from direct patient interaction and asking whether they warrant a reassessment." Prakash rubbed his face. He was 28, she guessed, and still at the stage of his career where the right answer and the safe answer were visibly in conflict. "Selby's not going to—" "I'm aware of how Selby's going to respond. I'm asking what you think." Another silence. He looked at his printed results. He looked at the floor. "I'll raise it," he said finally, "in morning rounds. I'll frame it as a flag for reassessment. That's all I'm asking." He nodded and walked away, and Mara watched him go and calculated his chances at roughly 40%, and returned to the 4th floor and checked her other patients and waited. The call light from room 412 activated at 11:17 that night. Mara was at the nurse's station finishing a chart when it came up on the board, and she was moving before the overnight nurse had finished processing that it was lit. Not running. The floor had rules about running, but moving with the particular efficiency of someone who'd learned to cover ground quickly without alarming anyone. The room was dark except for the monitor, amber. Voss was where she'd left him, his breathing unchanged, his vitals steady on the screen. But his eyes were open, and they found her the moment she crossed the threshold. She checked him, the automatic check, hands and eyes and ears, and found nothing that explained the call light. It hadn't been accidental. The call was deliberate, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. She stood by the bed and said nothing for a moment. Then he began. The pattern was slower than before, more careful, she thought, and she followed it with full attention. It took 11 minutes. She had to ask clarifying questions twice. But by the end of it, she was standing in the dim amber light of room 412 at 11:28 at night, with a very particular kind of cold settling into her chest. He hadn't just confirmed sensation below the injury level. He'd confirmed that he'd had it from the beginning, from the first week at Hartwell, and that he'd tried to communicate it, and that someone on his care team had documented that he'd attempted to communicate and had written it off. He knew this because he'd been alert and oriented and comprehending every word spoken in his room for 11 weeks, while everyone around him operated on the assumption that he was, if not absent, then unreachable. 11 weeks. Every conversation, every assessment, every casual remark made by people who believed there was no one home to hear it. She didn't let what she felt show on her face. She was practiced at that. She said very quietly, "Are you telling me you understand the severity of what I'm describing?" One slow blink. "And you trust me to act on it?" One blink. She looked at him for a moment. In the amber light, his face was all planes and shadows, unreadable to anyone who didn't know what deliberate stillness looked like from the inside. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer is something you didn't intend to tell me." He waited. 11 weeks ago, when you came in, the first night, the overnight log noted a possible vocalization. 2 syllables. Nobody followed up. She paused. "What did you say?" The eye movement that followed was unlike the pattern she'd been reading. It wasn't yes, no, wasn't clarifying, wasn't the structured vocabulary they'd been building over 19 minutes this morning. It was something else. Slower, more deliberate, with a quality she couldn't name until she'd watched it 3 full times. It was a name. He was spelling something. She watched it happen. And when she understood what he'd spelled, what he'd been trying to say 11 weeks ago in a room where nobody was listening, Her breath left her in a way she couldn't entirely control. Because he'd spelled her call sign. Not her name. Not Mara Devlin, nurse, 4th floor. The two-word designation that had belonged to a different person in a different life, on missions that were never officially documented, in places she had never officially been. He'd known who she was from the first night. He'd been waiting. She stood very still in room 412 at 11:31, and outside in the corridor she could hear the overnight nurse's cart and the distant sound of a monitor cycling, and somewhere in the building's infrastructure something mechanical was running, and all of it was enormously far away. He blinked once, watching her. And Mara Devlin, who had once carried wounded men out of burning valleys and never spoken about it to anyone, looked at the Navy SEAL who had been conscious and comprehending and completely alone for 11 weeks, and felt the things she kept under control begin to move. She leaned close enough that her voice would carry no further than the space between them. "I hear you," she said. "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." One blink, slow, certain, like a man who had been holding his breath for 11 weeks and had just finally been allowed to exhale. She didn't sleep that night, not in the way that implied restlessness or anxiety. Mara had long since stopped being someone who lost sleep to anxiety. She lay on top of her covers in her apartment 12 minutes from the hospital and stared at the ceiling and ran through everything she knew with the systematic patience of someone who'd spent years making decisions in the dark with incomplete information. What she knew: Declan Voss was alert, oriented, and comprehending. He had sensation below the C5 to C6 injury level, inconsistent but present. His communication pattern was deliberate and voluntary. He'd known her identity from admission. He'd tried to communicate it immediately and been ignored. 11 weeks had passed. What she didn't know: why. Why he knew her call sign, why he'd been using it specifically. Whether the compression hypothesis she'd floated to Prakash had any imaging support, or whether she was building a case on clinical intuition and the terrifying possibility that she was right. She got up at 4:15. She made coffee she didn't taste. She drove to Hartwell in the dark and sat in the parking structure for 7 minutes, deciding how far she was willing to take this. The answer was the same one it had always been, in every situation that had required it, as far as it needed to go. She was at her cart by 5:20, and she moved through the morning with the same measured competence she always did, and nobody looking at her would have seen anything different. Prakash caught her at the lab pickup window at 7:50, before rounds. He looked like he hadn't slept well either. "I flagged it," he said without preamble. "What happened?" Selby said the behavioral observations weren't diagnostic, and that reassessing a complete cord lesion without new imaging data was a waste of resources. He paused. He also said, another pause, longer. He asked who'd prompted me to raise it. "And you told him?" "I'm sorry, he would have found out anyway." She nodded. "I know, it's fine." It wasn't fine, but it was predictable. And predictable she could work with. Selby found her at 9:03. She was in the med room and she heard his shoes before she heard his voice, that deliberate clip, and she kept her hands on what she was doing because she'd learned early that stillness read as confidence more reliably than anything else. "Nurse Devlin." She turned. He was standing in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man who considered this conversation a minor inconvenience in an otherwise organized morning. "Dr. Selby, I understand you've been conducting informal assessments in room 412. I've been observing my patient during scheduled vitals checks." "Your patient?" He said it without particular heat but with precision, the way you'd correct a child's grammar without wanting to make a scene. "Voss is under neurological care. Your role in that room is support and monitoring." "I agree. What I observed during monitoring is what I shared with Dr. Prakash." "What you observed," he said, "was confirmation bias. You decided you were seeing voluntary communication, and you interpreted every movement through that filter. It's a well-documented phenomenon in caregivers working with nonverbal patients. I'm not criticizing your instincts. I'm telling you they're wrong." She looked at him. She let him have the silence for 3 full seconds. "He has inconsistent sensation below the injury level," she said. He confirmed it through structured yes-no questioning. Selby stopped. The temperature in the room shifted. You conducted a structured assessment. I asked yes or no questions during my monitoring check. He responded using voluntary eye movement. The pause that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. She could see him deciding how seriously to take this, and how seriously to take the legal implications of what she'd just described. A nurse conducting an informal neurological assessment on a patient under specialist care. And she watched his posture shift almost imperceptibly as the calculation landed. Mara. His voice had dropped, which she'd learned was more dangerous than when it was loud. I'm going to be very direct with you, and I'd like you to hear me clearly. You were transferred to this floor because your previous department flagged concerns about your tendency to exceed your scope. I agreed to bring you on because I was short-staffed and because your technical skills are adequate. I want you to understand that adequate is conditional. She held his gaze. Are you asking me to stop reporting clinical observations? I'm asking you to understand your role. I understand my role. She paused. Do you want me to stop reporting clinical observations? He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, Don't go back to that room outside scheduled rounds, and walked out. She turned back to the medication trays and stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the counter, breathing deliberately, and did not let herself feel anything she couldn't afford to feel right now. She went back to that room outside scheduled rounds at 11:20. She wasn't reckless about it. She checked that Selby's car was still in the physician lot, confirmed he was in a scheduled procedure through the OR board, and gave herself a window of 40 minutes that she did not intend to use all of. Voss's eyes found her immediately. She pulled the chair close to the bed, close enough for a quiet conversation, and she sat in it, which she almost never did in patient rooms because it changed the dynamic in ways she preferred to control. Today, she sat. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm not telling it to you to make you feel a particular way. I'm telling you because you've been in this room for 11 weeks, and you've been making decisions without information. And that's not fair. She kept her voice level. The doctor running your case isn't going to order a reassessment based on what I've reported. I don't have the authority to order imaging. And the gap between what I believe is happening in your spine and what's currently in your chart is significant enough that I'm not sure how to close it through normal channels. He watched her. One slow blink. I can go outside normal channels, she said, but I want to be honest with you about what that means. It means filing a formal patient advocacy report through the hospital's ethics board. It means putting my name on a document that directly contradicts the attending neurologist. And it means, she paused, choosing the words carefully, that I can't guarantee the timeline. These processes take time, days, possibly longer. 2 blinks. She frowned. You're saying no? 1 blink. You don't want me to file a formal report. The eye movement that followed was more complex. He was working through something, building toward a response she needed to read carefully. She watched without rushing him. He was spelling again, slower this time, with more intention. She tracked the pattern. 3 letters, then a pause, then 3 more, then a stop. She read it twice to be certain. Call sign. You want me to contact someone? 1 blink, emphatic. Someone who knows your call sign. 1 blink. From your unit? A pause. 2 blinks. Not quite. From your command structure? Pause. 1 blink. Closer. She sat back in the chair and thought about what he was telling her and what it implied about who she'd need to reach and how she'd need to reach them and how much of herself she'd have to put on the table to make that call. I don't have those contacts anymore, she said quietly. I've been out for 6 years. He watched her. But I know someone who might, she said. She didn't tell him who. Some things were better left unsaid in rooms that might be less private than they appeared. His name was Roland Beckett, and he'd been her extraction coordinator on her 3rd deployment, and the last she'd heard he was living outside Bozeman doing something with property that wasn't the kind of thing she asked about. She had a number for him that was 2 years old, which in his world might or might not still work. She called from her car during her lunch break with the engine running and the windows up. It rang 4 times. She was counting. Yeah. His voice was the same, flat and alert simultaneously, the voice of someone who'd never fully come down from operational posture. It's Devlin. Shadow. A 2-second pause. Huh. Not surprise exactly, more like a file drawer opening. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. I know, I need something. How badly? She told him. Not everything. She gave him the essential architecture. A Tier 1 operator, 11 weeks in a military medical facility, a diagnosis she believed was wrong, a doctor she believed was blocking reassessment, and a communication she'd received that suggested the patient had channels she didn't have access to. Beckett listened without interrupting. That was something she'd always appreciated about him. What's the call sign you received? She hesitated. I'd rather not say it on this line. Fair. Another pause. You're at Hartwell? Yes? How certain are you on the clinical piece? Very. She paused. 85, 90%. And the 10%? Is that I'm a nurse who used to be a PJ, and I've never been wrong about this particular type of thing before, but there's always a first time. He almost laughed. She could hear it not quite happening. Give me 12 hours. I need faster than that. I know what you need. Give me 12 hours. He hung up. She sat with the deadline for a moment, then put the phone in her pocket and went back inside and spent the afternoon doing her job with the particular focus of someone who is very deliberately not thinking about the thing they're thinking about. Selby was watching her. She didn't catch him at it directly. He was too careful for that. But she felt it in the way the floor's energy had changed. The senior charge nurse, a heavy-set woman named Patricia, who ran the station with the efficiency of someone who'd survived 3 different chief administrators, had been less communicative than usual. One of the day nurses who normally chatted at the med room had found reasons to be somewhere else when Mara was there. It was subtle, institutional. The particular cold front that moves through a workplace when someone powerful has indicated disapproval. She'd experienced it before. Not here, but in analogous situations, and she knew the shape of it, how it built, what it was designed to accomplish, what it meant about the calculations Selby had made. He was preparing to remove her from the case. She didn't know the timeline. She didn't know whether it would come as a formal transfer request or something softer, a schedule reassignment, a quiet reorganization of ward responsibilities. What she knew was that it was coming, and that when it came, her access to room 412 would close, and Declan Voss would go back to being alone in there. At 3:47, she found something in his chart that stopped her cold. She was at the nurse's station doing a routine review when she pulled Voss's medication log, standard, something she did twice a week, and saw an entry from 12 days ago that she'd looked at before but not looked at. A sedative protocol. Low grade, the kind that read on the surface like standard post-injury sleep management. But the timing was wrong. The dosage schedule didn't align with any sleep protocol she recognized, and it had been initiated on day 3 of admission, before any documented sleep disturbance, before any behavioral flag, before anything that would clinically justify it. She looked at the authorizing signature. Selby. She looked at the end date. There wasn't one. She very carefully put the chart down and looked at the wall for a moment and thought about what a sustained low-level sedative protocol would do to a patient who was trying to communicate, who was trying to move, who was trying to fight their way through a misdiagnosed paralysis. What it would do to the clarity of his eye tracking, what it would do to his ability to initiate the call light, what it would do to 11 weeks of effort. She thought about Selby that morning, telling her she was seeing confirmation bias. She thought about him knowing, possibly knowing, that he'd chemically suppressed the very behaviors she'd been trying to report. The thing she kept under control moved again, and this time she let it because anger this specific and this cold was not something she needed to manage. It was something she needed to use. She photographed the chart page on her personal phone, a policy violation, she was aware, and texted the image to Beckett's number with the words, "Timeline moved. Call me tonight." Barset. He called at 9:14. "The protocol you described," he said, without preamble. "How long running?" 12 days documented, possibly longer if earlier entries were amended. Silence. "Roland," she said. "I'm here." His voice had changed in a way she recognized. He'd been moving through channels, and the channels had told him something. "I need you to hear something, and I need you to not react in a way that draws attention." "Go ahead." "The asset in room 412, he said, and the word asset, with its specific weight, confirmed three things at once about who Declan Voss actually was and what his presence at Hartwell represented. There are people who are aware he's there, people who've been monitoring his status. Monitoring and doing nothing for 11 weeks. It's more complicated than that. Roland, he has been alert and comprehending in that room for 11 weeks, while someone with a medical license ran a sedative protocol on him that I believe was designed to suppress his ability to communicate. It's not complicated. It's a crime." Beckett's silence had a texture to it. "I know," he said. "Believe me, I know. What I'm telling you is that the people who are aware of his situation have been building a legal picture before they move. They needed documentation." "They needed documentation," she kept her voice flat, "while he was in there. I'm not defending it. I'm telling you the context." She pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed through it. "What's the timeline now?" "There are 2 people coming to Hartwell tomorrow morning. They're not announcing themselves in advance. What I need you to do is be on that floor, be accessible, and do not do anything that gives Selby a reason to remove you before they arrive." "He's already planning to remove me." "Then do not give him an easy reason. Can you do that?" She thought about the chart photograph on her phone. She thought about room 412 and the amber light, and the man who'd been spelling her call sign with his eyes for 11 weeks. "Yes," she said. "Devlin." His voice had shifted again. Something she didn't hear from him often, something closer to ordinary. "You did the right thing, calling me." "Don't," she said. "Just get them here." She hung up and sat in the dark of her apartment and didn't sleep again. She arrived at 5:30, and the floor was quiet in the particular way of early morning in a hospital. The overnight staff running down the clock, the day shift not yet in, that seam in institutional time where things felt more exposed than they did at any other hour. She checked her other patients first. She was methodical about it. She did not allow herself to go to room 412 until 6:05, when it was genuinely her scheduled time. He was awake. He was almost always awake. She stood by the bed and ran her checks, and didn't say anything for a moment because she was listening to something she needed to be sure she was hearing. His breathing. It was different, not distressed, not an acute change, but there was an effort in it that hadn't been there yesterday. Something that took more work than it should have. She checked the monitor. Oxygen saturation at 93. Down from the 97 she'd charted yesterday morning. The kind of drop that could have a dozen explanations. Most of them benign, one of them not benign at all. She looked at him. "Are you having trouble breathing?" One blink. Slower than usual. The sedative timing, she noted. The morning dose hadn't cleared yet. "More than yesterday." One blink. She kept her voice even. "Does it feel like pressure?" A pause. One blink. Her hands were already moving, the reflex of someone who'd worked critical airways in less controlled conditions than this. Checking his neck, his chest rise, the supplemental oxygen line. Everything looked intact on the surface, but the saturation was 92 now, and she trusted the saturation number more than the surface. She stepped to the hallway and said, at normal volume to the overnight nurse still finishing her charting, "Get me a respiratory consult on 412 now." The nurse looked up. "Vitals are, I know what the vitals are. Get me respiratory." The nurse picked up the phone. Mara went back into the room and stood at the bedside and watched the monitor with the same stillness she'd have used watching a horizon for movement. 91. She said quietly, "I need you to stay with me, okay? I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He blinked. Once. The respiratory tech arrived in 8 minutes, which was good. The on-call physician arrived 11 minutes after that, which was less good, and it was not Selby. It was a hospitalist named Dr. Anand Ferreira, who was covering overnight and who listened to her presentation in the hallway with an expression that moved from skepticism to attention as she gave him the saturation trend and her observation about the breathing effort. He went in and assessed Voss and came back out 4 minutes later with a different expression entirely. "I want a chest film and a repeat neuroconsult this morning," he said. "I'm flagging this as a respiratory concern on the overnight report." "It needs to be in the main chart," she said, "not just the overnight report." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'll enter it in the main chart," he said. She nodded. "Thank you." She watched him go and turned back to the room and leaned against the doorframe for a moment, monitoring the saturation number, and thought, "This is moving faster than I expected and slower than it needs to." At 7:42, she was at the nurse's station when she saw Selby's name populate the morning schedule on the whiteboard, and she felt the morning narrow around her. At 8:09, she saw two people she didn't recognize walk off the elevator at the east end of the corridor. They were in civilian clothes, both of them, but they moved with a specific quality that she knew the way you knew your own name. The woman in front was perhaps 50, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who'd never fully let go of a uniform. The man behind her was younger, with the dense, careful stillness of someone who watched exits before anything else. They stopped at the nurse's station. The woman asked for the charge nurse. Patricia appeared, and something passed between them that Mara was too far down the corridor to hear, but she saw Patricia's expression change in a way that Patricia's expressions very rarely changed. Patricia looked up. Her eyes found Mara across the corridor. Mara held still. The woman with the silver hair turned to look at her. She didn't smile. She assessed, a rapid, complete professional assessment, and then she said, at a volume that carried just far enough, "Nurse Devlin." Not a question. Mara walked to them. She kept her stride even and her face quiet, and she looked at the woman, and the woman looked back, and between them, in the 3 seconds before anyone spoke, there was the particular recognition of people who belonged to the same world, even if they'd never occupied the same room. "We need 5 minutes," the woman said. "My shift rotation." "Patricia's covering," the woman said. And Patricia, who had never in 8 months done anything to suggest she found Mara worth covering for, nodded once without being asked. Mara looked at the woman. She looked at the man. She looked back at the woman. 5 minutes, she said. They walked to the family consultation room at the end of the hall, and the door closed, and the woman set a badge on the table that Mara looked at for 2 seconds before looking up. "How long have you known about the sedative protocol?" the woman asked. "I identified it yesterday afternoon." "And the compression hypothesis?" 3 days. The man spoke for the first time. "You were on the night of the Kessler Valley extraction." It wasn't a question either. Something very old shifted in her chest. "Yes." "Commander Voss identified you on admission." He paused. "The identification was flagged in a system that Dr. Selby doesn't have access to. We've been aware of what was happening in that room for approximately 9 days. Mara looked at him for a long moment. 9 days, she said. "Yes. And you're here now because his respiratory status changed overnight." The woman said it without flinching. "Because the situation escalated past the point where the legal documentation timeline could justify the delay." Mara felt the specific cold of that settle through her. She chose her next words very carefully. "I need to know whether he's going to be all right." The woman held her gaze. "That depends on what we find in the next 2 hours, which is why we're not having a longer conversation right now." She stood. "Selby is arriving in approximately 20 minutes. When he does, I need you on that floor, visible, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing." "And then?" "And then," the woman said, "we handle it." The door opened. They walked back into the corridor, and Mara took her position at the nurse's station and picked up a chart she wasn't reading and listened to the clock above the whiteboard move through 19 minutes and 40 seconds until she heard the elevator open at the end of the hall and heard the familiar clip of Selby's shoes and heard them stop. She looked up. Selby was standing 20 feet away, looking at the 2 people who were standing in the corridor of his unit, and on his face was an expression she had never seen there before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't the careful management of a man who was used to being the most powerful person in any room. It was something that looked, under everything, very much like fear. And before he could speak, the woman with the silver hair said, "Dr. Selby, my name is Colonel Adrian Wask, Office of the Inspector General, U.S. Department of Defense." She held up her credentials. We have some questions about your treatment protocol for the patient in room 412, and I'd appreciate it if we could speak somewhere private. The corridor had gone very quiet. Selby looked at Wask. He looked at the man beside her, and then, for reasons Mara didn't entirely understand until later, his gaze moved down the corridor to her. A long, still look that contained something she'd have to spend time unpacking. "Nurse Devlin," he said slowly. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The document was 3 pages. Mara couldn't read it from where she stood, but she'd seen enough JAG paperwork to recognize the structure. The formal header, the numbered paragraphs, the signature blocks at the bottom that meant this wasn't a preliminary notice or an administrative warning. This was something that had teeth. Selby read the first page. He read it the way people read things they already know are bad but need to confirm are exactly as bad as they feared. His face did very little. That was the tell. A man who normally managed his expression with such precision had stopped managing it, which meant the cognitive resources that usually ran that function were fully occupied elsewhere. He looked up. The JAG officer, her name tag read Captain Renata Osei, was watching him with the patience of someone who'd done this before and understood that the person holding the document needed a moment. "This is a formal notification of investigation," Selby said. Not a question, confirming. "Under Article 32 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, as applicable to civilian contractors operating under DoD oversight agreements," Osei said, "Hartwell Military Medical Center's federal contract status brings your care of Commander Voss within that jurisdiction. You have the right to retain counsel. I have counsel. Then I'd recommend contacting them immediately." She paused. "The investigation scope includes falsification of medical records, unauthorized pharmaceutical protocol, and deliberate suppression of diagnostic findings in a patient under federal protection." Another pause, briefer. "There may be additional charges forthcoming pending the outcome of this morning's surgical procedure." Selby looked at the document again. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked down the corridor to where Wask was standing, and something passed between them. Not communication, not anything that useful, just the mutual acknowledgement of 2 people who understood that the negotiating phase of whatever this was had ended. He went back into this consultation room and closed the door. Mara turned away. She had a patient in an OR, and that was the only thing that mattered right now. The OR waiting was the hardest part. It always had been. In the field, waiting was tactical. You used it, filled it with preparation, made the time functional. Here there was nothing functional to do. She'd checked everything she could check. The floor's other patients were stable. Her handoff notes were complete. She'd spoken to Yamane's surgical coordinator at 6:15 and been told the procedure had begun on time, and initial access was clean, and that was the last information available. She sat in the family waiting area outside the 4th floor corridor, the one that was almost always empty, the one she'd passed 200 times without ever sitting in. And she drank bad coffee from the machine down the hall and looked at the wall and did the things she'd learned to do in helicopters and forward operating bases and the backs of vehicles moving through places that didn't appear on civilian maps. She waited without burning herself out on waiting. It wasn't easy. It was a practice skill, and some days she was better at it than others. Wask sat down across from her at 7:20. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Wask had her own coffee, also from the machine, and she looked at it with mild displeasure before drinking it anyway. "The surgical audit team will want your log today," Wask said. "The complete version, including timestamps. I know, it's on my personal device. We'll need it transferred to a secured channel. My associate will handle the technical side." A pause. "The hospital's legal team has already submitted a formal complaint to the state nursing board citing unauthorized scope of practice." Mara said nothing. "It won't go anywhere," Wask said. "Our documentation of what was done in that room, the suppressed entries, the sedative protocol, the imaging findings, provides sufficient context to make the complaint untenable, but it will require a response. There's paperwork." "There's always paperwork." Wask almost smiled. "Yes." She drank her coffee. "I want to tell you something. And I want you to hear it as information, not as a commendation, because I think you prefer information. I do. The sedative protocol Selby implemented was not improvised, Wask said. The compound and the dosage schedule match a protocol that appeared in a research proposal submitted to a private medical ethics board 8 months ago, 14 months before Voss arrived here. Mara went very still. A research proposal, she said, studying the neurological and psychological effects of sustained isolation in patients with intact cognitive function but limited motor and communication capacity. Wask's voice was entirely level. The proposal was rejected by 3 ethics boards. Selby submitted it under a Shell affiliation, not Hartwell's name. The 4th board approved it with significant caveats, none of which appear to have been honored. The specific silence that followed had weight. He had a research protocol, Mara said slowly, before Voss arrived. Before any patient matching the profile arrived, Wask said. Voss fit the profile. The transfer request to Hartwell originated from a recommendation letter that we are currently examining. She paused. We believe Selby had contact with someone in the military medical transfer system. We don't have the name yet. Mara thought about 11 weeks. She thought about Selby in that room, 4 minutes, flipping 2 pages, marking no change, walking out. She thought about what it meant to look at a human being and see a research subject, and she felt something that wasn't quite anger, something colder than anger, more structural. How many patients? She asked. Wask looked at her directly. We're looking at 3 others, 2 deceased, one in a long-term care facility in Maryland with a documented neurological deterioration that may warrant re-examination. Mara put her coffee down on the chair beside her. She didn't trust her hands with it. He chose patients who couldn't speak, she said. Yes. And Voss was supposed to be one of them. Yes. She sat with that. Outside the window at the end of the waiting area, the morning had fully arrived. The parking lot bright, the city beyond the tree line moving through its ordinary business, entirely unaware of the specific thing that had been happening on the 4th floor of this building. What stopped him? She asked. With the others. What stopped him from being caught? The profile, Wask said simply. Patients who couldn't communicate and whose families were either absent or had limited access. Voss was different. His unit had been looking for him. Not officially, because the operation he was on doesn't officially exist, but actively, and Voss himself was different. She paused. You saw it. Yes. The original intake team assessed him as cognitively compromised within the first 48 hours. Selby's initial note supports that. But there's a counter note in the system from an ER nurse on the night of admission, a behavioral observation that suggests Voss was alert and tracking. That note was amended 3 days later. I know about the amended notes. The ER nurse who wrote the original, Wask said. Her name is Danya Farrell. She filed a formal concern 2 weeks after Voss's admission and was told it had been reviewed and addressed. She's agreed to testify. Mara absorbed that. There had been someone else, someone she'd never known about, who'd seen what she'd seen and had tried, and had been smoothed over in the institutional way that things get smoothed over when the person doing the smoothing has enough authority and enough practice. She waited 6 weeks before she filed the concern, Mara said. She was a first-year ER nurse. She questioned herself. Wask's voice had something almost human in it. People in positions like hers often do. Mara knew. She'd done it herself once, a long time ago, in a different situation with a different set of stakes, and the memory of the weeks she'd spent talking herself out of something that had turned out to be exactly what it looked like was something she didn't visit often. Is she being protected? Mara asked. We've been in contact with her since yesterday. Yes. Mara nodded. She picked up her coffee again. Her hands were fine. But Yamain came out at 11:47. She heard the OR corridor doors before she saw him, the specific hydraulic sound of those doors, which she'd been tracking with part of her attention for the past 5 hours, and she was on her feet before he cleared the threshold. He still had his surgical cap on. He pulled it off as he walked toward her and ran his hand over his hair, and she read his face in the 3 seconds before he spoke with the precision of someone who'd spent years reading faces in exactly these moments. Not disaster, not clean victory either. Something in between, which was what real things usually were. He's out, Yamane said. Stable, extubated, good airway, moving toward recovery. She exhaled. The compression? C6, as suspected, bone fragment with surrounding fibrosis, more extensive than the imaging suggested, which is often the case. He paused. I got it. Full decompression, good margin. The cord itself. He paused again, and this pause was different from the surgical ones. This one carried weight. There's viable tissue. I can tell you that definitively. The cord isn't transected. There is pathway there. But 11 weeks of compression causes its own damage. And the sedative protocol. He stopped. His voice had flattened in a specific way. A sustained low-dose benzo regimen in a patient with partial cord function suppresses the neuromuscular signaling that would normally maintain some residual tone below the injury level. The atrophy is more significant than I'd like. He looked at her directly. He will have function. I can tell you that with reasonable confidence. The extent of it, the timeline, I can't give you numbers tonight. She nodded. She'd known this was the shape of the answer. She'd prepared herself for it on the theoretical level, and the theoretical level and the actual level were different things, but she held it together because falling apart in this corridor helped no one. He's going to need rehabilitation, Yamane said. Significant, long-term. He knows that. He's known that for 11 weeks, she said. He just didn't know if he'd get the chance. Yamane looked at her for a moment. Then he said, he asked for you. When they extubated him, first thing. She nodded again. Her throat was doing something she was managing. Recovery is on the second floor, he said. I'll clear you for a visit at 1400 if you want to clean up first. I don't need to clean up. He almost smiled. No, I didn't think so. Mxiao. Recovery room B was quieter than the OR wing, the particular hush of a space designed to transition people back from one state of existence to another. She followed the recovery coordinator through the door at 1208, which was not 1400, but the coordinator had looked at her face and made a judgment call that Mara appreciated without acknowledging. Voss was in the third bay. He was pale in the specific way of post-surgical patients, with the oxygen cannula and the monitoring leads and the IV lines that made every recovering patient look temporarily disassembled. His eyes were open. They found her immediately. She pulled the chair up and sat in it, and for a moment neither of them did anything. The monitor beeped. Somewhere across the room a nurse was charting. The world outside this bay continued without particular interest in what was happening inside it. She said, Yamane says he got it. He blinked once. His eyes were clearer than she'd seen them in months. The sedative protocol discontinued as of yesterday, the surgical anesthesia metabolizing, and what she saw in them was something she didn't have a clinical term for. He says there's viable tissue. He says you'll have function. She paused. He doesn't know how much yet. He's being honest. One blink. I know you understand that, she said. I'm not translating it for you. I just wanted you to hear it directly. He moved his eyes in the spelling pattern. She tracked it. How long? Rehabilitation? Months. He'll tell you more when you're fully out of anesthesia and he can assess your baseline responses. She looked at him. You know it's going to be hard. One blink. The quality of it, something that was almost wry, if a blink could be wry, made her throat do the thing again. There's something else, she said. I need to tell you because you have the right to know, and because I think you already suspect some of it. She'd thought about how to frame this. She'd decided on direct, because he'd been surviving on direct for 11 weeks, and he deserved to keep having it. The investigation has found evidence that your placement at Hartwell wasn't incidental. Selby had a prior research protocol. We think your case was arranged. He watched her, not surprised. She'd thought he might not be. You knew something was wrong, she said. One blink. From the beginning. One blink. Is that why you used the call sign? To find someone outside the normal channels? The spelling came slowly. Anesthesia lag, she noted, not sedative, and the difference was everything. But it came. Only person I trusted. She looked at that for a moment. She was aware of its weight, and she didn't deflect it, but she also didn't make it bigger than what it was, which was a practical decision made by a man with very limited options. You had good instincts, she said. One blink, and then he spelled again, slower still. You stayed. She didn't answer that immediately. She sat with it. Yeah, she said finally. I stayed. At 2:15, while Voss was sleeping, real sleep, not chemically managed, not the flat absence of the past 11 weeks, Mara went back to the 4th floor and found it transformed in the way that places transform when something that was invisible becomes visible. The 2 administrators were gone. Patricia was at the station, and when Mara came off the elevator, she looked up and said, "They cleared your schedule for the rest of the day," which was the closest Patricia had come to warmth in 8 months, and Mara took it for what it was. Wask found her at 2:40 in the med room. Selby's been placed on administrative suspension pending the investigation, she said. Hospital board convened an emergency session this morning. His OR access has been revoked and his patient caseload has been reassigned. She paused. The state medical board has been notified. A formal license review is scheduled. Timeline on the criminal charges? JAG moves at its own pace. The federal component, the DoD contract violations, will likely move faster than the state criminal process. Wask looked at her. The 2 deceased patients, their cases are being referred to a federal prosecutor. Selby's attorney has been in contact with the prosecutor's office since 9 this morning. Cooperating? Exploring options. Wask's expression communicated what she thought of that without her saying it. The contact in the military medical transfer system, the person who routed Voss to Hartwell. We have a name. I can't share it, but the investigation has it. Mara nodded. The hospital's complaint to the nursing board. I've spoken to the board's investigative coordinator. Given the context, they've agreed to defer any action pending the outcome of the primary investigation. Wask paused. I want to be honest with you. There will still be a process. The complaint was formally filed. It has to be answered. I know how processes work. Yes. A pause. The photograph you took of the chart. Violation of policy. It is. And it's also the document that made the case for an expedited investigation timeline because it proved the sedative protocol existed before we could formally subpoena the chart. Wask looked at her steadily. The board coordinator is aware of the context. I believe the process will resolve in your favor. I am not in a position to guarantee it. Mara had known all of this was coming. She'd made the calculation when she took the photograph, and she'd known exactly what she was putting on the table. Knowing something was going to happen and experiencing it happening were different things, but the gap between them was manageable. Is there anything else you need from me today? She asked. Your testimony. In writing, sworn, by end of week. My associate will send you the format. Done. She paused. Danya Farrell, the ER nurse. She's been interviewed. She's represented. I'd like to speak with her, not about the case, just... Mara stopped. She wasn't sure exactly what she wanted to say to Danya Farrell, except that she understood something about what the past months had been like for a first-year nurse who'd seen something and filed a concern and been told it had been handled, and had presumably spent every day since wondering. I'll pass that on to her, Wask said. It's her choice. I know. Wask picked up her jacket from the chair she'd draped it over. She paused at the door. Nurse Devlin. She turned. When this investigation concludes, and it will take time, these things always take more time than they should. There will be a formal recognition process. Your role in identifying the situation will be part of the record. I know you don't need it, Wask said. I'm telling you, it's happening anyway, because the record matters. Not for you. For the next person in a room like yours who sees something and wonders whether it's worth the cost of saying so. She held Mara's gaze for a moment. It needs to be on record that it was. She left. Mara stood in the med room alone and looked at the shelves of supplies she'd restocked 100 times and thought about the record and what it meant and what it cost to create it and whether the cost was worth it. She didn't have a clean answer. She wasn't sure clean answers were available for questions like that. She went back to the floor. Prakash found her at 4:30. He looked better than he had yesterday. Not good, but better, which was what progress looked like in people who'd been through something that hadn't finished processing. I gave my interview this morning, he said. To Wask's team. Good. I told them everything, including what I should have pushed harder on. He paused. I've been thinking about the day you came to me at the lab window. I could have... Prakash. She said it without harshness. You did what you did. You flagged it. That had consequences. She looked at him. What you should have done differently isn't the most useful thing to spend time on right now. He was quiet for a moment. He's going to be okay? Yamani thinks so. It'll take time. He nodded. The other patients, the ones they're looking at. He stopped. He was young enough that some things still hit him with their full weight rather than the managed weight of someone who'd learned to distribute it. I worked here during... You didn't know. I know I didn't know. That's not... He stopped again. It doesn't make it better. She looked at him. She thought about something true and useful to say, which was not always the same as something comforting, and she settled on, the way it gets better is you pay attention from now on. That's all. He looked at the floor, then he looked at her. Why didn't you leave when Selby warned you off? She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated, and she didn't fully understand all of it herself. Because I've left before, she said, when I should have stayed, and I knew what that felt like afterward. He didn't ask what she meant. She was glad. But at 6 o'clock, Mara signed out and took the stairs because she needed the movement. She was on the second floor landing when her phone buzzed, a message from a number she didn't know. This is Danya Farrell. Colonel Wask passed on your message. I'd like to talk if you're willing. I'm still in the building. Cafeteria. She stood on the landing for a moment. Then she went down to the cafeteria. Danya Farrell was 24, maybe 25, with the specific look of someone who'd been keeping it together by willpower alone for an extended period and was starting to feel the seams. She was sitting at a corner table with a coffee she wasn't drinking, and when Mara sat down across from her, she looked up with an expression that was part relief and part something that had been pressing on her chest for months. I filed the concern at week 2, she said, without preamble. Selby called me in. He explained. He was very good at explaining. He said the behavioral flags I'd observed were documented neurological artifacts consistent with the injury profile. He said I should focus on my ER rotation. A pause. I almost believed him. Almost, Mara said. I went back and looked at my notes from the intake night, and I knew what I'd seen. She looked at her coffee. But I'm a first year. He's published. He runs a unit. He has a research program. I thought maybe I was wrong. You weren't wrong, Mara said. I know that now. She paused. I kept thinking, if I'd pushed harder at week 2, if I hadn't let him explain it away. Mara looked at her. She said, I saw it at week 1. I let 3 weeks go by before I went to Prakash. I let another week go by before I called someone who could actually do something. She kept her voice level. I'm not telling you that to minimize what you're feeling. I'm telling you because I think you need to hear that the person who's been doing this for 15 years also had to talk herself into it. Danya looked at her. Did you ever think you were wrong? Every single day, until I wasn't, Mara said. Danya Farrell looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee and drank some of it, and Mara watched the seams hold, and they sat there together in the hospital cafeteria. In the particular exhausted company of 2 people who'd done the right thing the hard way and were still in the middle of finding out what that cost. What? She left the hospital at 7:20. She was in the parking structure, 3rd level, keys in hand, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Thomas Garrett, the administrator with the document from this morning, was walking toward her. He was alone. His jacket was off and his tie was loosened, and he had the look of a man who'd had a very long day and had decided to do something at the end of it that was either brave or foolish. She waited. He stopped 10 feet away. I need to tell you something, he said. She didn't respond, which was its own kind of response. The complaint to the nursing board, he said. It was filed this morning on instructions from the chief medical officer. I was the one who sent it. He looked at the ground and then back at her. I didn't know the full scope of the situation when I sent it. I knew there was a physician under investigation, and I was managing a liability exposure, and I sent the complaint because that's what I was told to do. He paused. I want you to know I've submitted an amended communication to the board this afternoon, withdrawing the hospital's active support for the complaint. She looked at him. On whose instructions? My own. He said it with the specific quality of someone who'd done something that cost them something. The CMO's going to hear about it tomorrow. I'm aware. She studied him for a moment. He was perhaps 50, with the look of a man who'd spent a career being good at the wrong thing and had just this afternoon decided to be bad at it. Okay, she said. That's all I wanted. I heard you, she said. It wasn't warm. It wasn't dismissive either. It was what she had available. He nodded and walked back toward the elevator, and Mara watched him go and thought about the specific category of person who did the right thing late and what you were supposed to do with them. She got in her car. She sat there for a moment before starting it. The parking structure was quiet in the way of late evenings. A few cars, the distant hum of the ventilation system, the sound of the city filtered through concrete. Her phone rang. Beckett. Update, he said when she answered. Surgery went well. Yamane is cautiously optimistic. Selby suspended. JAG has filed. She paused. Wask thinks there's a contact in the military transfer system. They have a name. A pause on his end. I know the name, he said. She went still. How long have you known it? I had a strong suspicion when I made the first calls yesterday morning. I confirmed it this afternoon through a channel I'd rather not explain. Another pause. It's someone at the rank of colonel, medical corps. He and Selby have a shared publication history going back 8 years. She looked at the steering wheel. She thought about what that meant. A network, not an individual. A collaboration that had been running long enough to have a publication history. And she thought about the 3 other patients and the 2 who were deceased and the approved research proposal that 4 ethics boards had collectively tried to stop. Does Wask have it? She asked. She will by morning. I'm not the right person to hand it to directly. No, she agreed. Send it through OC. Already done. A pause. Devlin, are you all right? She thought about the question. She thought about what all right meant after a day that had started at 4:45 and contained approximately 15 different things that each could have been the whole of someone's difficult day. I'm functional, she said. That's usually your version of yes. Then yes, he paused. The man in 412, he's stable, post-op. She paused. He's going to need a long time. He's got one now. Beckett let that sit. What you did in there, Mara, I've run a lot of operations. I've worked with a lot of people under pressure. What you did, that was Roland. What? Don't. A beat of silence. Yeah, he said. Okay. And then, get some sleep. She drove home in the dark. She ate, showered, checked her phone once for messages, and found nothing from Wask, which meant nothing had broken overnight, which was good. She set 1 alarm instead of 2. She was almost asleep when the call came. Not her phone. Her personal line, which had a different ring, which only a handful of people had. She looked at the screen. The number wasn't one she recognized. She answered. Silence for a moment. Then a voice, male, institutional in the way of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where the language was precise and the stakes were always present. Nurse Devlin, my name is Brigadier General Stanton Albrecht. I apologize for the hour. She sat up. She knew that name. Not from Beckett, not from Wask, from a briefing document she'd read 7 years ago in a room that was later classified at a level she didn't have access to anymore, and whose contents she'd been told explicitly that she did not need to retain. She had retained them anyway, because she retained everything. Albrecht had been the commanding officer of the unit 2 levels above Voss's. He was, she realized, the reason the Kessler Valley operation existed. He was the reason she'd been in that helicopter. I know who you are, she said. I know you do. A pause. I've been briefed on the situation at Hartwell. I've spoken with Colonel Wask. I want to speak with you personally. It's 2200 hours, General. Yes. He didn't apologize again. Nurse Devlin, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer directly. Go ahead. In the course of the past 48 hours, did you at any point discuss the nature of Commander Voss's operational history with any individual outside of the cleared contacts in this investigation? She went still. No. Did Commander Voss communicate anything to you, through the eye-tracking methodology you developed with him, about the specific nature of his last operation? She thought about the 19 minutes and the questions she'd asked, and the answers she'd tracked. She thought about what he'd confirmed, and what he hadn't. No, she said. The communications were limited to medical and situational information. He confirmed sensation levels, general timeline, and the identity of the medical contact he wanted me to reach. You're certain? General, I've had this clearance before. I know the line. Another pause. Longer. There's a component of the investigation that Wask's team isn't fully aware of yet, Albrecht said. It pertains to why Commander Voss was on the operation that resulted in his injury. He paused. And it pertains to why a specific person wanted him incapacitated, unable to communicate, and out of the institutional picture for as long as possible. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. The research protocol, she said slowly. That was cover. Silence. General, her voice was very level. Are you telling me that Selby wasn't the primary target of this investigation? I'm telling you, Albrecht said carefully, that what was done to Commander Voss in that room served two purposes. The research was real. The research was also convenient. A pause. The person whose name Wask's team found in the transfer system this afternoon, the colonel in the medical course, he is not the end of the chain. The parking structure, the quiet, Garrett walking away, Danya Farrell's hands around her coffee cup. 11 weeks. She sat in the dark of her bedroom and felt the shape of it change. Not bigger exactly, but deeper. A thing she'd thought she understood becoming something she'd only understood the surface of. What do you need from me? She asked. At 0600 tomorrow, Albrecht said. There will be a classified briefing at Hartwell. Wask will be there, so will JAG. So will people from two agencies I won't name on this line. He paused. I'd like you there as well. In what capacity? As the person who has spent more unobserved time with Commander Voss than anyone in this building, and who he has chosen to trust with information he has not communicated to anyone else. A pause. There's something he communicated to you that you may not have recognized as significant. Something about the operation. She went through the 19 minutes. She went through every pattern, every spelling, every yes-no sequence she'd run with Voss since the night he'd first made himself known to her. And then, in the specific way that things you filed correctly suddenly present themselves when the right question asks for them, she found it. Week 3. A late-night session. She'd been asking about his pre-admission timeline. Not the operation, she'd deliberately avoided that, but the timeline of the injury itself, the immediate aftermath. He'd confirmed the field hospital. He'd confirmed the initial transfer. And then he'd spelled something she'd logged and moved past because she hadn't had the context for it. A name. Not a person's name. A designation. 2 letters and a number. The kind of shorthand that meant nothing without the framework around it and meant everything with it. She hadn't had the framework then. She thought she might have it now. General, she said, I need to ask you about something he communicated at week 3. I need to know if the designation OP14 means what I think it means. The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. When Albrecht spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that told her everything before he said a word. Be at Hartwell at 0600, he said. Don't discuss this on any line. The call ended. She sat in the dark and looked at the wall and thought about Declan Voss in a recovery room 2 floors below the room where he'd spent 11 weeks, and thought about what he'd known all along and had been waiting, patiently, strategically, with the specific patience of someone who understood that you don't use your only card until you know who's at the table. He hadn't just been waiting to be rescued. He'd been waiting for the right moment to tell someone what he knew. And the thing he knew wasn't about Selby. She didn't sleep after Albrecht's call. She lay in the dark and turned OP14 over in her mind the way you turn something fragile. Carefully, with full attention, making sure you understand the weight of it before you decide what to do with it. She didn't have enough context to be certain. She had enough to understand that whatever Voss had been carrying in that room for 11 weeks was larger than a misdiagnosis and larger than one corrupt physician and larger, possibly, than anything Wask's team had walked into Hartwell expecting to find. At 4:30, she got up. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and wrote out everything she remembered from the week 3 session in the same careful longhand she'd used for her nursing log. The sequence, the timing, the exact pattern of the spelling, the context of the question she'd been asking when it emerged. She wrote it twice, and the second version was cleaner and more precise than the first, which was how she knew she'd gotten it right. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and drove to Hartwell in the dark. The briefing room was on the administrative floor, which she'd been to twice in 8 months, and neither time voluntarily. At 5:58, she stepped off the elevator into a corridor that had more people in it than it usually contained at any hour, and all of them had the specific quality of people who'd arrived early because they understood what early meant in situations like this one. Wask was there. Osei was there. The 2 JAG officers and Albrecht's aide-de-camp, and 3 people whose affiliations Mara didn't ask about and wasn't told. Prakash was not there, which made sense. Patricia was not there. The man whose name she now knew from Beckett, the colonel in the medical corps, was not there in person, but his photograph was on the table when she walked in, printed on a single sheet alongside 2 other photographs she didn't recognize. Albrecht was at the head of the table. He was taller than she'd expected, with the economy of movement of someone who'd stopped wasting energy on anything non-essential sometime in his 40s. He looked at her when she walked in, and she looked back, and the 3 seconds of mutual assessment between them had a quality of 2 people confirming something they'd each suspected from a single phone call. He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "Tell me about OP14. Someone at the table made a sound that might have been a suppressed reaction. Wask's expression didn't change, but something in her posture acknowledged the directness. Albrecht said, "Sit down, Nurse Devlin." She sat. He told her. OP14 was not an operation. It was a program, a procurement authorization that existed in the gap between military research funding and private medical contracts. The kind of institutional gray zone that gets created when people with authority and ambition find each other and agree that oversight is a problem to be managed rather than a function to be respected. It had been running, in various forms, for 4 years. Selby was one node. The colonel in the medical corps, his name was Harlan Teague, was another. There were 2 others whose names Albrecht gave her with the flat precision of someone reading a list of structural failures. The program used military patients, specifically patients in the narrow profile that Selby had identified in his research proposal, cognitively intact, severely motor impaired, communication limited, with either no family or family without institutional access. It used them because they were available, because they were already in systems that OP14's participants could influence, and because the alternative, finding civilian volunteers for research that no legitimate ethics board would approve, carried exposure that these men had decided was unacceptable. Voss had been targeted specifically because his last operation had taken him close enough to OP14's infrastructure to constitute a risk. He'd seen something. The details were still classified at a level Albrecht didn't give her, and she didn't ask. What mattered was the mechanism. Teague had recommended the transfer. Selby had received the patient. The research protocol had provided cover that made an incapacitated, silent seal look like a medical case and nothing more. Except Voss had been neither silent nor incapacitated in the ways that mattered. She put the folded paper on the table. "Week 3, she said. "He spelled this during a late session. I logged it and moved on because I didn't have the framework." She pushed it toward Albrecht. "I have it now." Albrecht looked at the paper. He looked at Wask. He looked back at Mara. "He communicated this to you 6 weeks ago," he said. "Yes." "And you're certain of the spelling?" "I tracked it twice in real time and reconstructed it from memory last night. I'm certain." The room was very quiet for a moment. Albrecht passed the paper to the person on his right, one of the unintroduced 3, who looked at it and said something quietly to the person beside them. "This is a sub-designation," Albrecht said. "OP14 Kilo. It identifies a specific procurement channel." He paused. "It's the piece we haven't been able to locate in the documentation trail, the financial architecture of how the program moved money." Another pause. "Where it comes from in the documentation is what we've needed." She looked at him. "He knew what he was giving you." "Yes." Albrecht held her gaze. He's been holding it, waiting for confirmation that it was going to the right people. A pause that was quieter than the others, waiting for confirmation that you were the right people. She sat with that. Voss in room 412, spelling her call sign on the night of admission. 11 weeks of patience, the call light at 11:17, the deliberate strategic management of what he revealed and when. He hadn't just been waiting for rescue. He'd been running an operation from a hospital bed using the only asset he had available, which was a nurse in blue scrubs who happened to be the one person in the building he had reason to trust. She thought about that for a long time after the briefing ended. Bam! The arrests happened over 3 days, which was not the clean simultaneous sweep that happened in less complicated situations, but it was thorough. Teague was taken into custody at his office at the Pentagon on a Tuesday morning, which Wask told her about in a text message that contained 4 words and a case number. Selby was arrested at his home, not the hospital. He'd been barred from the building since his suspension, on Wednesday afternoon, by which point the federal charges had expanded to include conspiracy, involuntary manslaughter in connection with the 2 deceased patients, and violations of the federal research ethics statute that carried a sentencing range she didn't look up because the number wasn't the point. The 2 other OP-14 participants were handled by people Mara never met, through processes she was never briefed on, and she was comfortable with that. She had enough to carry. The story reached the press on Thursday, not from Wask's office. They'd managed the release carefully through the JAG Public Affairs channel in language that was precise about what had been done and to whom without compromising the operational details that remained classified. What it said, in the plain language underneath the institutional phrasing, was that a network of individuals had used military patients as unconsented research subjects, that a decorated officer had been specifically targeted for incapacitation, and that the scheme had been uncovered in part through the clinical observations of a 4th-floor nurse at Hartwell Military Medical Center. Her name was in the 4th paragraph. She read it on her phone sitting in her car in the parking structure. The same parking structure, the same 3rd level, the same fluorescent hum, and she sat with the specific strangeness of seeing her name in a document she hadn't written, attached to a version of events that was accurate but felt, from the inside, like a description of someone she only partly recognized. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd done a job badly at first and then better, and who had been afraid the entire time and had done it anyway, and who was now sitting in a parking structure trying to decide what to eat for lunch. She got a sandwich from the cafeteria. She ate it at the corner table where she'd sat with Danya Farrell, and she thought about the gap between what things look like from the outside and what they feel like from the inside. And she thought that gap was probably important and that someone should say so more often. Bam. 6 weeks after the surgery, Declan Voss moved the fingers of his left hand. Not a twitch, an intentional movement. 3 fingers, a slow curl and extension that Yamane documented with the specific contained satisfaction of a surgeon who'd believed in a procedure and had just watched it be right. The motor pathway was there, damaged, slow, requiring effort that would have exhausted most people after 30 seconds, but there. Mara was in the room when it happened. She was there because she'd been reassigned to the rehabilitation wing 3 weeks after the arrests, a transfer that had come from hospital administration with a formality that she recognized as institutional acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't apologize directly but repositions you somewhere better and calls it a restructuring. She'd accepted it because the work was good, and because the 4th floor had too many memories layered into its walls, and she was ready for a room with different light. She'd been checking in on Voss during his daily sessions, not as his assigned nurse. Yamane had built a specific rehab team around him, but in the way that people who've been through something together find reasons to be in the same space. It wasn't sentimental. It was practical. He communicated better with her than with anyone else, which was a clinical fact that the rehab team had noted and incorporated. The morning the fingers moved, she was reviewing his session log at the workstation outside his room. When she heard the therapist, a steady, competent man named Dove, who had the specific gift of celebrating progress without making the patient feel observed, say, quietly, "There it is." She looked through the window. Voss's left hand was on the therapy board. 3 fingers, curved, moving. She didn't go in. She stayed at the workstation and watched through the glass and felt something complete itself in her chest that had been open for a long time. He looked up, through the window, at her. She pressed her palm flat against the glass for a moment. He blinked once. Hut. The nursing board process took 11 weeks, a timeline that she'd decided was the universe's idea of a specific joke, and resolved with a formal finding of no violation. The written determination cited the context of the clinical situation, the nature of the information obtained, and the documented outcome. It also cited, in dry institutional language that nonetheless meant what it said, that the complaint had been filed by a party who was themselves the subject of a federal criminal investigation, which did not affect the legal standard, but was noted as relevant context. She read the determination once and filed it, and didn't think about it again, because the outcome she'd needed from that process was the one that let her keep doing the work, and she had that, and the rest was paperwork. Danya Farrell had been offered a position in the fourth-floor nursing team following the staff reorganization that came after Selby's arrest. She'd taken it. Mara saw her occasionally in the corridors, and they had the particular relationship of two people who'd been through something adjacent and difficult, and who understood each other without needing to explain it. They got coffee twice. They talked about work, mostly, sometimes about other things. Dove told her, at week 9 of Voss's rehabilitation, that the progress was faster than the model predicted. Not dramatically. There was no single morning where everything changed, no clean before and after that would have made a good story. What there was, instead, was the slow accumulation of increment, more movement, better control, the first time he was able to use the communication board with his hand instead of his eyes, the first time he sat upright without support for 4 minutes, and then 8 minutes, and then 20. Yaman came by twice a week and assessed and recalibrated and said little, which from him was as close to enthusiasm as the situation got. Mara did not let herself project forward. She'd learned that lesson in rooms where projecting forward was how you started making decisions based on what you hoped rather than what was, and she'd seen what that cost. She took each session as its own thing, documented what she observed with the same precision she'd always used, and let the accumulation mean what it meant. At week 14, Declan Voss spoke a complete sentence aloud for the first time since his injury. It was during a morning session with Dove. Mara wasn't in the room. She was at the workstation, and she heard it through the partially open door. Rough, effortful, the voice of someone relearning a thing they'd known for decades. And what he said was not remarkable in content, but was everything in the saying of it. He said, "That's not how you do it." Dove had apparently made an error in setting up a resistance exercise, and Voss had watched and calculated and apparently decided that silence was not the appropriate response. Dove said, "I'm sorry?" Voss said, slower this time, but clearer. "The angle. It should be 15 degrees, not 30. Mara sat at the workstation and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote it in the log, because it was clinical data, and because she was someone who documented things, and because she understood that the first complete sentence spoken by a man who'd spent 11 weeks communicating through his eyelids deserved to be on the record, even if it was about the angle of a resistance board. She smiled at the wall by herself, which nobody saw, and then she went back to work. The sentencing for Warren Selby happened on a Thursday, 4.5 months after his arrest. She didn't attend. She'd given her testimony, sworn, in person, 2 months earlier, and the legal process after that was not something she needed to be present for. Wask's office sent her a summary by secure message that afternoon. Federal charges. Guilty plea on 3 counts, including conspiracy and research ethics violations, sentencing to 9 years in a federal facility with eligibility for review at 6. The state medical board had already revoked his license permanently. The civil proceedings brought by the families of the 2 deceased patients were ongoing. Harlan Teague had pled not guilty and was awaiting trial, which would take another year at minimum. The other 2 OP-14 participants had entered cooperation agreements in exchange for reduced exposure, and Wask had told her, in one of their last conversations, that the cooperation had produced documentation that extended the investigation's reach further than the original scope. She'd said, "How much further?" Wask had said, "Further than I can discuss with you," which was an answer of a kind. She thought about Selby sometimes. Not often, and not with the sustained attention that would have indicated something unresolved, but occasionally, the way you think about something that still confuses you. He'd been genuinely brilliant. She'd seen enough of his work to know that. The tragedy of it, if tragedy was the right word for something that had also been a choice made repeatedly over many years, was that the brilliance hadn't been enough for him. He needed something more, something that the publication record and the unit and the reputation hadn't given him, and he'd found it in the worst possible direction. She didn't understand it. She'd decided she didn't need to. Selby walked into the consultation room and the door closed behind him, and the corridor settled back into its ordinary sounds. The monitor cycling, the cartwheels, the low institutional hum of a building that didn't stop for anything. And Mara stood at the nurse's station and picked up the chart she still wasn't reading and waited. Patricia moved to her left without being asked and began entering something into the system with the focused efficiency of a woman who'd decided she had somewhere to be that wasn't here. Nobody on the floor spoke. The two overnight nurses finishing their handoff notes had both found reasons to look at their screens. Mara checked the clock. 8:31. She put the chart down and walked to room 412. She wasn't supposed to. She had no clinical reason to be there in this moment. But she was done calculating the exact perimeter of what she was supposed to do, and the saturation number from this morning was still sitting in her chest like a stone, and Declan Voss had been alone in that room for 11 weeks, and she was not going to leave him alone in it now. He was awake. The morning light was coming in differently than usual. Someone on the overnight had adjusted the blinds, and the room had a flatter quality to it, less amber, more gray. His saturation was reading 94 on the monitor, which was better than 630, but not good enough. She stood by the bed. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the monitor, she looked at him, she did the quick visual check she'd done 100 times, chest rise, skin color, the subtle tells of a patient in a body they couldn't fully feel. His eyes found her. The tracking was clearer than it had been at 6. The morning sedative dose was metabolizing. And what she read in his face wasn't fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Attention, the specific alertness of someone who'd been listening through a closed door and could hear that the sounds on the other side had changed. She said quietly, "2 people from the DOD Inspector General's office are in the building. They're talking to Selby right now." He watched her. "I don't know how long it takes. I don't know what comes next exactly." She paused. "But I need you to know that what's happening out there has your name on it. Your actual name, not your chart." One slow blink. "Your breathing is still off," she said. "I'm going to request a repeat pulse ox trend, and I want you to tell me if anything changes, if the pressure gets worse, if anything feels different." She moved to the monitor and noted the numbers. "Blink twice if the pressure in your chest has increased since this morning." He blinked once, a pause, once more. Twice. She absorbed that. When did it start? Last night? One blink. Before last night? 2 blinks. So overnight. Or this morning. One blink. She was already at the doorway. She stopped and looked back at him once. That specific look, the one she'd given people before walking into situations where she couldn't make any promises. And then she stepped into the corridor and moved to the station and pulled up his respiratory chart from overnight and started reading with the focused speed of someone who'd been trained to extract critical information from noise in under 60 seconds. The chest film ordered by Ferreira had been done at 7:15. The results were in the system. She opened the image. She looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she picked up the phone and paged respiratory. And while it rang, she was already walking back toward 412 because what she was looking at on that film was not minor, and it was not ambiguous, and it explained the saturation and the pressure. And it meant the timeline she'd been given, 2 hours, was a number that had just gotten a great deal smaller. The respiratory therapist, a compact, precise man named Jervis, who she'd worked with twice before and trusted, arrived in 6 minutes and reviewed the film with her in the corridor outside 412. He looked at it longer than she had. "That's a right-sided effusion," he said. "I know. Not large, but it's growing. Look at the comparison from admission." She pulled the admission film on the tablet. "That's 11 weeks of fluid accumulation. Jervis looked at both images side by side and said nothing for a moment. Whose is attending? Selby. Something moved across Jervis's face. Selby's in a meeting with, I know where Selby is. I need you to tell me who can authorize an urgent respiratory consult in his absence. Ferreira's still on the floor until 9. Get Ferreira. Jervis was already moving. Mara went back into 412 and positioned herself where she could see both the monitor and the door, and began the particular discipline of managing two simultaneous problems at once, the man in the bed and the institutional machinery that would determine whether she could help him in time. She'd done it before, in different circumstances, with the sound of things she didn't want to think about as the backdrop. Here there were no sounds like that. Here there was just the monitor and his breathing, which she was timing in her head. 12 breaths per minute, slightly labored on the inhale. The chest movement asymmetric in a way that was subtle enough that most people on the floor wouldn't catch it. She caught it. Ferreira arrived at 8:52 and reviewed the film and the saturation trend and stood at the bedside and did a quick percussion exam, the hollow versus dull tap across the chest wall that was basic but reliable. And his expression, when he straightened, confirmed what she already knew. I'm putting in an urgent thoracic consult, he said, and I'm documenting a pleural effusion, possible developing respiratory compromise. It needs to go to the charge nurse as an escalation flag. I'm aware. And it needs to happen before Selby comes out of that meeting. Ferreira looked at her. He was a hospitalist, a generalist, not a specialist, and his authority in this corridor was limited in ways that were about to matter. He knew it. She knew it. I'll do what I can, he said. It wasn't what she wanted. She accepted it because it was what was available. The consultation room door opened at 9:17. Selby came out first. His face had been rearranged, the same features, but something underneath them had shifted, the way a structure looks different after its foundation has moved. He walked to the nurse's station and stood there for a moment looking at the board, and Mara, from the doorway of 412, watched him absorb the escalation flag that Ferreira had entered. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned. Colonel Wask came out of the consultation room behind him, with the man whose name Mara still didn't have, and they positioned themselves in the corridor with the specific patience of people who weren't finished. Selby looked at the flag. He looked at the doorway of 412. He looked, last, at Mara. What did you do? He said. It came out flat, not quite a question. I flagged a respiratory concern at 6:30 this morning, she said. Dr. Ferreira ordered a chest film. The results showed a right-sided pleural effusion. I called for a thoracic consult. You called for a... He stopped, controlled himself. You do not have the authority to initiate... I flagged the concern. Dr. Ferreira initiated the consult. She paused. Would you like to review the chest film? Something was happening in the corridor that she could feel but not entirely see. Wask's posture, the specific quality of her stillness, the way she was watching Selby with the attention of someone who was not watching a doctor respond to a clinical problem, but watching a man respond to a trap closing. Selby turned to Ferreira, who had materialized at the station. I want that consult canceled. Ferreira blinked. The effusion is documented. If I cancel a consult on a documented... I am the attending neurologist on this case, and I am telling you, Dr. Selby... Wask's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I'd ask you not to do that. Selby turned to look at her with an expression that was the most genuinely human thing Mara had seen on his face in 8 months. The mask had slipped 2 inches, and underneath it was a man doing rapid, visible arithmetic. This is a clinical matter, he said. It is, Wask agreed. It's also a matter that falls within the scope of our review. Any modification to Commander Voss's treatment plan from this point forward is subject to documentation and justification. She held his gaze. Please proceed as you see fit. We'll be observing. The corridor held its breath. Selby looked at the chest film on the station monitor. He looked at the saturation trend. He looked at room 412. And something happened in his face that Mara watched with the specific attention of someone cataloging evidence. Not satisfaction. She refused to let it be satisfaction yet. Just the clean, careful noting of a man who understood that the geometry of his situation had changed in a way he hadn't controlled. He picked up the phone and said to whoever answered, "Get me thoracic on the 4th floor. Voss 412. Tell them I want a consult this morning." He hung up. He did not look at Mara. She didn't make him. Hukits. The thoracic surgeon who arrived at 10:40 was a woman named Dr. Priya Solanki, who had the efficiently unsentimental manner of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with problems inside the chest wall and had very little patience for anything she couldn't fix with a drain. She reviewed the film, examined Voss, and came out of the room to talk to Selby in the corridor with Mara close enough to hear. "He needs a thoracentesis," Solanki said. "I want to drain it today. The effusion's large enough that it's compromising his respiratory mechanics, and given his immobility situation, that's going to compound fast. He's a complex case. All my cases are complex. Do I have authorization or not?" Selby paused. "I want to be present." "Fine. Or 3, 1 o'clock. Solanki turned and nearly walked into Mara. She looked at her. "You're the nurse who flagged this?" "Yes." Solanki glanced at the chart in her hand. "Good catch." She walked away. It was 11 words. They landed like something considerably heavier. Sad. Between 10:40 and noon, the floor restructured itself around the new reality with the efficiency of a hospital that was, whatever its internal politics, fundamentally organized around not letting people die. Mara moved through her responsibilities and watched the second layer of activity happening around her. Wask and her associate in and out of the consultation room, a phone call at the nurses' station that Patricia handled with an expression of controlled alarm, 2 people in suits from hospital administration appearing briefly on the floor and then disappearing again in the direction of the executive wing. She was at the med room at 11:40 when Prakash found her. He looked like he'd been awake for 30 hours. He probably had. "They're pulling his full chart history," he said. "Everything. The DOD people. They have a subpoena." He paused. "Mara, they found amended entries." She went still. "In the chart. 3 entries from weeks 2 and 3. The original versions are in the system audit trail. The hospital's IT system keeps amendment records. Someone changed documentation about behavioral observations." She thought about the overnight log entry. Possible vocalization. Unclear. The way it had been written, the specific flatness of it. "What was changed?" she asked, though she already knew the shape of it. "Entries noting that the patient appeared to attempt communication. The amended versions describe the same behaviors as involuntary neurological activity." He swallowed. "The original entries are from the overnight nurses. The amendments were made by a single user with attending-level access." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and in his face was the particular expression of someone who'd trusted the architecture of their institution and had just watched a load-bearing wall fail. "You didn't know," she said. "No." He said it quietly. "I didn't know." She believed him. She also knew it didn't change the 11 weeks, and she knew he knew that too, and there was nothing useful to say about it, so she didn't say anything. At 11:58, Colonel Wask came to find her. Not to the nurses' station. She came to the med room, where Mara was alone, and she closed the door partially and stood with her arms at her sides and said, "We need to discuss what happens this afternoon." "The thoracentesis," Mara said. "After. The thoracentesis will stabilize his respiratory function. But the neurological situation is more urgent than we initially assessed." Wask's voice was level and specific, which Mara appreciated. "We've been in contact with a spinal decompression specialist, Dr. Haruto Yamane, at the National Military Medical Center in Bethesda. He's reviewed Voss's imaging remotely this morning." Mara felt something shift in her chest. "And?" "He believes there's a treatable compression at C6. Incomplete. Not a full transection. The imaging pattern is consistent with epidural fibrosis developing around a bone fragment that wasn't addressed in the initial surgical report." The initial surgical report from the field hospital, which Selby received on admission and documented as reviewed and unremarkable. The specific weight of that. "It's not unremarkable," Mara said. "No." It's not. Wask paused. Dr. Yamane is flying in tonight. He's prepared to operate tomorrow morning if the thoracentesis goes cleanly today. Mara looked at the wall for a moment. She was doing the math that any person with her training would do. The weeks of compression, the nerve involvement, the saturation drop, the cascade of what untreated epidural fibrosis did to spinal cord function over time. And she was doing it with the part of her mind that was clinical and precise. And in a separate part, she was thinking about a man lying in a room 10 meters away who had spent 11 weeks spelling her name with his eyes. "What are his chances?" she asked. "Yamane won't commit to a number before he examines him in person," which is honest. "I know. What does he think?" Wask paused. "He said the outcome depends significantly on how aggressively the compression has been managed in the interim." It hadn't been managed. Mara knew that and Wask knew that, and the word interim sat in the room between them, and neither of them said what it meant. "What do you need from me?" Mara asked. "Your first-hand clinical observations. Everything you documented in your personal log. Your account of what you observed during your interactions with Voss." Wask's expression didn't change. "We also need you to stay on this floor, stay accessible, and not give the hospital administration a reason to suspend you before tomorrow morning." "They're considering suspending me. Administration has been in contact with Selby's attorney in the last hour. There's a narrative being constructed about unauthorized clinical intervention and HIPAA implications related to the chart photograph." A pause. "I'm telling you this so you understand the landscape, not to frighten you." Mara nodded. "I understand the landscape." "I know you do." For the first time, something in Wask's expression shifted towards something that wasn't purely operational. "Voss specifically requested that you be present for whatever comes next. It's in a written communication he was able to provide this morning. We gave him an eye-tracking board." A slight pause. "It took him about 4 minutes to compose it. Our analyst said he wrote your call sign at the top." Mara looked at the door. She looked back at Wask. "I'll be here," she said. The thoracentesis happened at 1:15, 45 minutes behind schedule, because Selby had raised a last-minute procedural objection that Solanki had overridden with the specific efficiency of someone who was done being delayed. Mara wasn't in the OR. Her clearance didn't extend there. But she was at the nurse's station when they brought Voss back at 3:04, and she checked the monitor numbers before anything else. Saturation, 97. She let out a breath she'd been managing for 9 hours. His color was better. The asymmetric chest movement was gone. He looked exhausted in the way that people look after their body has spent hours working around a problem that's finally been addressed. A profound and specific tiredness that was, paradoxically, a good sign. She did his post-procedure check at 3:20, and he was awake the whole time, tracking her without the sedative lag. And when she was done and standing at the foot of the bed, he moved his eyes in a pattern she hadn't seen him use before. 3 movements, deliberate, a pause between each. She watched it twice. "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow's the harder part." He blinked once, and there was something in it that wasn't agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement. The recognition of someone who'd been in enough situations where tomorrow was the harder part to know she was right. Dr. Haruto Yamane arrived at Hartwell at 7:40 that evening. Mara wasn't supposed to know this. She was off shift. She was supposed to be home. Instead, she was in her car in the parking structure because Roland Beckett had sent her a 3-word text at 6:50 that said, "He just landed," and she understood the implication well enough to stay. Beckett had also told her, in a separate message, that Selby had retained legal counsel and that hospital administration had sent a formal communication to Wask's office disputing the scope of the DOD review. This was not a surprise. It was the move she'd have expected from someone trying to manage the velocity of consequences, and it would slow things but not stop them. What it meant for tomorrow was less clear. She sat in the car and read the message twice, and then put her phone in her pocket and sat with the quiet of the parking structure for a while. 7 floors of concrete and artificial light, and the distant sound of the city outside. And in here, just her and the specific weight of the past 36 hours. She was not someone who spent a lot of time examining her own decisions. She'd made them. They were made. and the work was in what came next. But there was a version of the last 48 hours she could see clearly. The version where she'd heard Selby's warning and adjusted accordingly, where she'd filed nothing and photographed nothing and kept her head down and maintained the adequate performance that was conditional on her silence. And she sat with that version for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. Her phone rang at 8:02. Wask's number. She answered on the first ring. Dr. Yamane has completed his examination, Wask said. He's confirmed the compression. He wants to operate at 6:30 tomorrow morning. That's fast. Yamane's assessment is that every additional day increases the risk of permanent cord involvement. He's not wrong. A pause. He's asked to meet with you tonight. He reviewed your clinical observations, the full log, and he has questions. Where? 4th floor family consultation room, 30 minutes. She was already getting out of the car. Sit. Yamane was smaller than she'd expected from his reputation, and considerably more direct. He was 60, or close to it, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the specific manner of a surgeon who'd made enough decisions under pressure to have stopped performing certainty and started just having it. He shook her hand and sat down and opened a folder and said, "Walk me through the eye-tracking observations from day 1. She did. He listened the way she liked to be listened to, without interruption, with occasional precise questions, writing nothing down because he didn't need to. She gave him everything in the order it had happened, and he tracked it with the quality of attention that she recognized as genuine evaluation, not courtesy. When she finished, he sat back. The sedative protocol, he said. You think it was designed to suppress communication attempts. I think the timing is consistent with that. Whether it was the primary intent, it suppressed motor activity as well. His voice was flat. Low-level benzodiazepine compounds at a sustained dose would have impaired any residual voluntary movement below the injury level, movement that might have flagged a reassessment. He paused. In a compression injury with intact partial function, suppressing that residual activity for 11 weeks is clinically significant. She felt the weight of that settle. How significant? She asked. I won't know until I'm inside. He looked at her directly. But I want you to understand that we're not operating on someone who had 11 weeks of appropriate conservative management. We're operating on someone who had 11 weeks of... He stopped, chose a word carefully. Neglect. And that changes the picture. She sat with that. He's strong, she said. It came out before she decided to say it. Yamane looked at her. Physically? Constitutionally, whatever they... She paused. He's been in that room for 11 weeks, comprehending everything, unable to move or speak except for what I described to you. And he's been focused, strategic. He wasn't waiting to be rescued. He was working toward it. She stopped because she was aware she was crossing from clinical observation into something else. I'm sorry, that's not... It's relevant, Yamane said. Patient psychology going into a procedure this significant is relevant. He closed the folder. I'm going to need you on the floor at 5:30 tomorrow morning. Not in the OR. I can't clear you for that. But available. I'll be there. Whatever happens in that room tomorrow, he said, with the particular steadiness of someone who'd learned to say true things cleanly, you bought him the chance to find out. That's what I wanted to tell you. She nodded. She didn't trust herself with more than that. Tikam. She was back in her car by 9:15. She drove home in the dark and ate something she didn't taste and set 2 alarms for 4:45 because she wasn't going to sleep through either of them. At 11:03, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. It was a photograph, a document, shot on someone's phone camera in the flat light of an office. She zoomed in. It was an internal hospital email, dated today, sent at 9:47 p.m. From the chief medical officer's address to 3 recipients, one of whom was Selby's name. She read it twice. The language was careful. Institutional language always was. But the substance was not ambiguous. It described a preliminary administrative review of nursing conduct on the 4th floor, cited potential violations of scope of practice and patient privacy regulations, and noted that a temporary reassignment pending review was being considered for the staff member in question. Her name was in the third paragraph. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Wask's warning. She thought about the attorney Selby had retained and the speed with which hospital administration had aligned with him. And she thought about the specific architecture of what was being built, not just a defense, but a preemptive move designed to discredit a witness before the witness could fully speak. She put the phone down. She picked it up again and called Beckett. He answered on the second ring. "I saw it," he said. "How?" "Doesn't matter. Wask's team has it too." A pause. "They're going to try to pull you from the floor before the operation." "I know." "Devlin." His voice had that quality again. "If they succeed, it doesn't change what happens tomorrow. Yamane operates regardless." I know that too." "So what are you—" "I'm going to be on that floor at 5:30, she said. "They can try to remove me after that." A pause. "They might." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Roland, what was his call sign, Voss? What did he go by?" Beckett was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Spectre," he said finally. She thought about that. About a man who'd survived things she'd only been adjacent to, who'd spent 11 weeks in a room being erased, who'd held on with the only tools left to him. His eyes, his patience, his certainty that she would eventually hear him. Spectre, like something the world had decided wasn't there. She set the alarms and lay down in the dark, and at 4:43, 22 minutes before they went off, she was already awake. She drove to Hartwell in the black of early morning, parked in the structure, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and stepped out into the corridor at 5:28. There were two people she didn't recognize standing at the nurses' station. Suits, not military, administrative. They were talking to Patricia, who was looking at the floor with the expression of someone being asked to do something she'd rather not do. They saw Mara the moment she stepped off the elevator. One of them, a man in his 40s with the energy of someone who'd rehearsed this, took 2 steps toward her. "Nurse Devlin." "I'm Thomas Garrett, hospital administration." "I need to inform you that pending an ongoing review, you've been temporarily—" "I'm on shift," she said. "Your shift has been reassigned." "I'm on shift," she said again, same tone, same volume, and kept walking. He stepped into her path. She stopped. She looked at him, not at his badge, not at the paper he was starting to produce from his jacket, at him, with the specific quality of attention she'd developed in situations where someone needed to understand very quickly that she was not going to be stopped. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "there is a patient on this floor going into surgery in 50 minutes. I have been his primary nurse for 8 months. I'm going to perform my pre-op check, and I'm going to be available when he is brought to the OR, and after that you can have whatever conversation you need to have with me." She paused. "If you want to physically prevent me, I'd suggest you call someone with the authority to do that, because you don't have it." He stared at her. Behind him, Patricia was looking up from the floor, and down the corridor, from the direction of the elevator bank on the east side of the floor, came the sound of footsteps, and Mara looked past Garrett's shoulder and saw Colonel Wask coming toward them with her associate, and behind them a third person she recognized from yesterday as one of the DOD's legal team. Wask's voice carried clearly without being raised. "Mr. Garrett, Thomas Garrett, Hospital Administration." Not a question. "My name is Colonel Adrian Wask, Office of the Inspector General. I need you to step away from that nurse right now." Garrett turned. What happened in the next 40 seconds involved credentials and a brief, intense exchange that Mara partially heard and partially didn't because she was already moving down the corridor toward room 412. And behind her she could hear Wask's voice carrying the specific authority of someone who did not need to raise it to make a building rearrange itself around her. Room 412 was lit. Yamani's pre-op team had already been in. She could see the prep evidence, the positioning, the chart flagged for OR transfer. Voss was awake, as she'd known he would be. His eyes found her immediately. She came to the bed. She checked the monitor from reflex, and the numbers were what she needed them to be, and she looked at him and he looked back at her and she said, "It's today." One blink. "Yamane's ready. The team is ready." She paused. "How are you?" His eyes moved. She tracked the pattern. Ready. She looked at him for a moment. In the flat pre-dawn light of the room, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who'd been through something that would have broken most people and hadn't broken him, and who was now about to go into an OR and find out what 11 weeks of fighting in the dark had bought him. "I'll be here when you come out," she said. One blink. She stepped back as the transport team came through the door, and she watched them prepare the bed for movement. And she was following them into the corridor when her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she checked it without breaking stride. A message from Beckett. "Check the east corridor. Now." She looked up. At the far end of the fourth-floor corridor, past the nurses' station, past Wask and Garrett and Patricia and all of it, 3 men in uniform were stepping off the east elevator. Not dress uniforms. Working uniforms. The kind worn by people who'd come from somewhere and were going somewhere and had not stopped to change. She didn't recognize 2 of them. The third one she knew. Not personally. She'd never been in the same room with him. But she knew his rank, and she knew his face from a briefing photograph that was 7 years old and apparently very accurate, and she understood in the 3 seconds it took him to scan the corridor and locate room 412 exactly what his presence meant. He was the commanding officer of the unit Declan Voss had served with. He was here, in person, at 5:42 in the morning, and behind him, as the elevator opened a second time, came 2 people in different uniforms, not Navy, not DOD, with the specific insignia of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Mara looked at the transport team moving Voss's bed into the corridor. She looked at Wask, who had stopped speaking mid-sentence and was watching the east elevator with an expression that was not surprise but was as close to it as Mara had seen her come. She looked at Garrett, whose paper was still in his hand and who appeared to have forgotten it was there. And then she looked at the door of the consultation room, which was opening, and at Warren Selby stepping out of it, probably following the sound of footsteps, probably expecting the hallway to look like it had an hour ago, and stopping. He stopped and looked at the 3 men in uniform, and the 2 JAG officers, and the DOD colonel, and her associate, and the administrator with the paper in his hand, and the nurses at the station, and Mara at the midpoint of all of it, and all the blood left his face in a way that she watched with the careful attention of someone who understood that this was a man seeing, for the first time, the complete shape of what he'd built and what it was going to cost him. The transport team was still moving. Voss's bed was coming into the corridor, and at the moment it cleared the doorframe of room 412. At the moment, Declan Voss came into the full light of the corridor for the first time in 11 weeks. The commanding officer at the end of the hall looked at the bed and went completely still. Whatever he felt in that moment, he kept it in his face, which was more than most men would have managed. He straightened. He walked forward. He stopped at the foot of the bed, and he looked at the man lying in it, 11 weeks older, thinner, with a right-side chest drain and 11 weeks of accumulated damage. And he said something so quietly that Mara, standing 6 feet away, couldn't hear the words. But she saw Voss's eyes. And what she saw in them, not relief, not gratitude, something older and more specific. The recognition between 2 people who'd been in the same darkness and had both, against reasonable odds, found a way to still be standing. Whatever it was, it lasted for 3 seconds before the transport team moved again and the OR's timeline reasserted itself over everything. The commanding officer stepped back. He looked at Mara. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Your shadow." She said, "I used to be." He held her gaze. "Ma'am," he said, and there was something in it that was not a pleasantry and not a formality, just the specific weight of someone acknowledging a debt they didn't yet have the words to repay. The transport team took Voss around the corner toward the OR wing. Mara stood in the corridor and watched him go, and behind her she could hear Wask's voice resuming, something sharp and specific directed at Garrett, and the JAG officers moving toward the consultation room, and somewhere in the distance the sound of Selby's shoes, and then the sound of them stopping. She turned around. Selby was still at the consultation room door. One of the JAG officers, A woman with the careful posture of someone delivering something she'd rehearsed was holding out a document. He looked at it. He looked at the officer. He looked down the corridor to where Mara was standing. She looked back at him without expression. He reached out and took the document, and his hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. What she understood was what he'd done and who he'd done it to, and that was enough to carry into the room where she worked every day without losing the thread of why she was there. The program was Wask's idea, and she brought it to Mara in the cafeteria on a Tuesday in the 5th month, over coffee that was marginally better than the machine because the cafeteria had gotten a new equipment contract, and someone in administration had made a good decision for once. The Inspector General's office is establishing an oversight protocol for veteran patients in civilian-military hybrid medical facilities, Wask said. Congressional authorization came through last week. It includes a patient advocacy component, a specialist role embedded in the facility, with cross-departmental access and independent reporting authority. Mara looked at her coffee. I'd like you to consider the role at Hartwell, Wask said. I'm a nurse. The role is designed for someone with clinical training. The nursing credential is a requirement, not a limitation. Wask paused. It also requires someone who understands both the military patient population and the institutional dynamics of a civilian medical environment, and someone who has demonstrated the capacity to identify problems that the existing system is designed, either intentionally or incidentally, to obscure. She held Mara's gaze. There are 3 other facilities where this program is being implemented. I have candidates for all of them. I don't have a candidate for Hartwell. Why Hartwell specifically? Because Hartwell is where this happened, which means it's where the institutional resistance to this kind of oversight will be highest, which means it's where I need the person who's hardest to move. She paused. That's you. Mara sat with that. She thought about the 4th floor and the supply cart and the morning rounds she hadn't been invited to and the 8 months of adequate performance she'd delivered in deliberate silence. She thought about Danya Farrell at the corner table and Prakash at the lab window and the specific machinery of institutions that preferred their problems quiet. She thought about room 412 and what had been happening in it and who had seen it and who hadn't. If I take this, she said, I need independent documentation authority, not filtered through the CMO's office. Built into the protocol, and access to patient records across all wards, not just assigned cases. That's the design. And when I flag something, the process that follows has to have teeth, not a review that goes into a file and disappears. The reporting structure goes directly to the IG's office, Wask said. Teeth is the baseline. Mara looked at the table. She looked at the window. She looked at Wask. I want Danya Farrell as my clinical support, she said. Wask didn't hesitate. Talk to her. If she's willing, I'll authorize the secondment. Mara picked up her coffee. Okay, she said. Okay, you'll consider it? Or, okay, she said again, and Wask, for the 2nd time in their acquaintance, came close to smiling. She told Voss about it during a session in the 7th month, when he'd graduated from the bed to a chair, and from the chair to assisted standing, and from assisted standing to the first 4 steps that Dove had documented with a precision that bordered on reverence. He could hold a pen. His handwriting was different than it had been. She didn't know what it had been before, but the therapist showed her comparison samples, and the current version was slower and more deliberate, and still completely his. He'd written her a note, which Dove had brought her with the neutral expression of a man who understood his role and what it didn't include. It was 3 lines on a piece of therapy paper. Yamane says another 6 months before we know the ceiling. I told him I've been past ceilings before. He didn't laugh, but I think he wanted to. She'd read it twice and put it in her jacket pocket. The day she told him about the program, he was sitting in the rehabilitation chair by the window, with the autumn light coming in at a low angle and looking, for the first time since she'd known him, like a person occupying space voluntarily rather than being confined to it. He still moved carefully. He still fatigued faster than frustrated him, which she could see in the specific tightening around his eyes during long sessions. He was not fixed. He might not be what he'd been before. Those were facts he was living with, day by day, in the way that people live with facts that don't resolve cleanly, which was the only way such things can be lived with. She told him about the advocacy role and what it would cover, and how the reporting structure worked. He listened. Then he said, in the voice that was still rebuilding itself, rougher than it would become, more effort than it would take in another year. "You're good at what you're doing." "I'm adequate," she said. He looked at her. "That's not what I said." She looked back at him. "I know." A pause. "The program needs someone," she said. "WASC needs someone at Hartwell specifically. I know this building. I know what it does when it wants to hide something." She paused. "I know what it sounds like when someone's trying to reach you through the only channel they have." Voss was quiet for a moment. The light moved. Outside, someone on a lower floor had their window open, and the sound of the city came in briefly and then faded. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The night they brought me in, the ER nurse—" He stopped. The effort of building toward something complicated was still visible in him, though less than it had been. She saw it. First night, she tried. "Danya," Mara said, "I know. I want her to know I know." He looked at her directly. That it mattered, even if it didn't, even when it didn't work. That she saw it. Mara thought about Danya Farrell sitting in the corner of the cafeteria with cold coffee and 6 months of doubt. She thought about what it meant to be told, by the specific person, that what you'd seen had been real and that the seeing of it had mattered. "I'll tell her," she said. "I'd rather she heard it from me," he said. She looked at him. "Then we'll arrange that." He nodded. He looked at the window. Then he said, with the particular directness of someone who'd spent 11 weeks unable to say anything and had developed a low tolerance for saying things that weren't worth the effort, "You saved my life twice. You know what I mean." She did. And she sat with it, not deflecting, not minimizing, but actually sitting with it, which was harder than both of those options and more honest. "You saved your own life," she said finally. "You held on. You kept the information. You used what you had." She paused. "I just showed up." He looked at her for a long moment. "Showing up," he said, "is the whole thing." She thought about that. She thought it was probably true, and that it was also more complicated than it sounded, and that both things were true simultaneously, and that this was generally how the important things worked. She started the advocacy role on a Monday in late autumn, which felt right to her in the way that starting things in autumn felt right. The sense of a season that was honest about what it was, that didn't pretend to be easier than it was, that required specific gear and specific patience, and delivered in exchange a clarity that other seasons didn't. Her office was small and on the second floor and had a window that looked out over the parking structure, which she thought was either a bureaucratic oversight or someone's idea of appropriate. She'd taken the photograph of her log off her personal phone and printed it. The first page, the week 1 entries, the specific handwriting of someone who was still figuring out what she was looking at, and put it on the wall above the desk not as a trophy but as a reminder of the specific texture of uncertainty, what it felt like to see something and not know if you were right, what it cost to act anyway. Danya knocked on the door at 8:15 on the first morning. She looked different from the cafeteria conversation, less pressed down, or maybe just differently pressed down, the weight redistributed rather than removed. She'd cut her hair. She was carrying a notebook and a coffee from the machine in the corridor and looking at Mara with the expression of someone who'd made a decision they weren't entirely sure about and were committed to anyway. "You're sure you want me for this?" she said. "I'm sure," Mara said. "I'm not—" Danya stopped. "I filed a concern and then I backed off. That's my record." "You filed a concern in your second month as a working nurse against an attending neurologist with 20 years in the building," Mara said. "And then you testified, on the record, in a federal investigation." She looked at her. "That's also your record." Danya looked at the floor, then up. "What do we actually do?" Mara turned to the desk. She opened the intake folder that WASC's office had sent, the current patient roster, the flagged cases that the new protocol required review, the documentation checklist that was thorough in the way that things built after failures tend to be thorough. "We pay attention," she said. "We document what we see. We report what we find through channels that can't be smoothed over." She paused. And when someone is trying to tell us something, through whatever means they have, we listen. Danya sat down in the second chair and opened her notebook. They went to work. What's that? Months moved the way they do when the work is real, not quickly or easily, but with the specific weight of things that matter. The program identified 2 cases in its first 3 months that warranted escalation. Neither was on the scale of what had happened in room 412. One was a medication protocol that had drifted from its authorization without documentation, corrected before harm occurred. One was a patient with limited English who'd been consistently misassessed in ways that had less to do with malice and more to do with a system that hadn't built in adequate translation support, and whose resolution required 7 meetings and a policy revision and the sustained pressure of someone who knew how to apply it without being removed. Small things, important things. The kind of things that don't make news and don't end careers and don't result in federal charges, but that are the everyday texture of what goes wrong when nobody is watching, and the difference between a system that works and one that doesn't. She was good at the work. She'd known she would be, not from arrogance, but from the specific self-knowledge of someone who'd spent a career developing a particular set of skills and had finally found the place those skills were exactly what was needed. Voss came to the 2nd floor on a morning in the 9th month after his surgery, walking with a cane and the careful concentration of someone who'd decided that careful concentration was the appropriate response to a body that was rebuilding itself on its own schedule. He walked down the corridor to her office door and stood in it and looked at the space, the small window, the photograph on the wall, the 2 chairs and the desk covered in files, and she looked at him standing and felt something she didn't name. "Dove cleared you for stairs," she said. "Last week." He looked at the photograph on the wall. He looked at it for a long moment. "Is that from the first week?" "Yes." He nodded. He didn't say anything about it, and she didn't explain it, because neither of them needed the explanation. He sat down in the second chair, which was Danya's chair when Danya was there, and rested the cane against the desk, and looked at her with the directness that she'd come to understand was simply how he operated. Not trained, not performed, just the natural mode of someone who'd lost the luxury of indirectness and had never particularly missed it. "I'm being transferred to Bethesda next month," he said, "for the next phase of the rehab program. Yamane has a colleague there." "I know, he told me." "I wanted to tell you myself." A pause. "I'm going to walk out of this building. I thought you should know that." She looked at him. "I never doubted that," she said, which was not entirely true but was true enough, and the part that wasn't true was the part that she'd managed in private and that had been hers to manage. He looked at her steadily. "You're going to keep doing this?" "Yes." "The program?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I was in that room, the first weeks, before you heard me," he paused, "I kept running probability, whether anyone would see it, whether the window for doing anything was closing." He looked at the window. "I knew you were on the floor. I could hear your rounds. I could track the timing, but I didn't know what you'd do with what you saw, whether it would be enough." She waited. "What made the difference," he said, "was that you stayed past your reason to. The formal checkboxes were done. You stayed anyway." He looked at her. "That's the thing that's hard to build into a system. That's the thing that depends on the specific person." She thought about that. She thought about the log on the wall and the supply cart and the 8 months of building something quietly inside a structure that hadn't known it was being built. "You can build it into a system," she said, "not the instinct. You can't mandate that. But you can build the conditions where it's possible, where someone who has the instinct isn't removed for using it." She paused. "That's what this is." He considered that. He nodded once, which was his way of telling her he understood and agreed and didn't need to add to it. He stood. He picked up the cane. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "They're giving me a commendation," he said. "The unit. A ceremony. It's a whole thing." He looked faintly uncomfortable, which she found humanizing. "They want you there." She looked at him. "As what?" "As the person who should be there," he said simply. She thought about standing in a room in her blue scrubs and being thanked by people in uniforms, and all the versions of herself that had existed between the helicopter and this office, and whether those versions were different people or the same person in different light. "When is it?" she asked. 3 weeks. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded. He walked out of the doorway and down the corridor toward the elevator, moving with the cane and the careful attention of someone doing something that was hard and doing it anyway, and she watched him go from the doorway of her office, this small office with the parking structure view and the photograph on the wall, until he turned the corner and disappeared. She went back to her desk. She opened the next file in the intake stack. A patient on the 3rd floor, limited mobility, family overseas, flagged for a follow-up review that had been pending for 2 weeks, and she started reading with the full attention she gave everything she read. Because this was the thing she'd learned across all of it. The work didn't stop. The system didn't fix itself because you'd fixed one part of it. There was always a next file and a next floor and a next person lying in a room somewhere trying to reach someone through the only channel they had, and the question was never whether they were there. The question was only whether you were paying enough attention to hear them. She'd spent a long time being invisible in corridors where people looked through her. She'd spent a long time keeping her past behind her like something to be ashamed of, as though the ability to carry people out of impossible situations was a liability, rather than exactly what it was. She knew something different now. Not because she'd been recognized. Recognition was a thing that happened and then was over. But because she'd watched what happened when someone who could see the thing clearly decided that the cost of saying so was worth paying. She'd paid it. She'd carry the paperwork for years, probably. The nursing board file would exist somewhere. The photograph she'd taken in violation of policy would be a footnote in a federal case forever. She'd do it again tomorrow without thinking twice. That was the truth of it, underneath all the other truths. Not that she was brave or exceptional or the right person in the right place, but that she'd seen something that mattered and she'd refused to look away from it. And in the end, that refusal was the whole thing. Everything else, the operation and the arrests and the program and Voss walking down the corridor with a cane and the commendation ceremony 3 weeks out, all of it had followed from that single, quiet, costly refusal. She turned to the next page of the file. She kept reading.